The moon hung full and watchful over the small cemetery outside Merrill Creek, Arizona. Its silver light caught on the weathered headstones, transforming them into pale sentinels in the darkness. The only sound was the rhythmic scrape of metal against earth, a sound that did not belong in this place of eternal rest. Rebecca Harper dug with the determination of someone who had learned that desperation could fuel strength beyond what her body should possess. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, now hung limp and stained around her swollen belly. 7 months along, maybe more. Her face, once soft with youthful optimism, had been carved into something harder by months of fear and miles of dust. The hole wasn't large, just big enough for the small wooden box clutched beside her. Her breathing came in short gasps as she paused, one hand pressing against the small of her back, while the other cradled her belly. The child within stirred, as if sensing its mother's disquiet. "Just a little longer," she whispered both to the child and to herself. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the scent of horses and leather. Rebecca froze, shovel still gripped in trembling hands. She wasn't alone. "Evening's an unusual time for gardening," came a voice from the shadows, low and quiet, but it carried across the stillness like a gunshot. Rebecca spun, nearly losing her balance as her foot slipped on the loose dirt. The shovel came up defensively, though her arms shook with the effort of holding it. The figure stepped forward, and moonlight revealed a tall man with broad shoulders narrowed by years of solitary work. Nathan Caldwell, owner of the small horse ranch beyond the ridge. Everyone in the territory knew of him, though few knew him. He'd kept to himself since settling here 5 years back. "Stay away," Rebecca warned, voice steadier than her hands. Nathan didn't advance further. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, moved from her face to her belly, then to the small wooden box at her feet. His expression remained unchanged, unreadable in the half-light. "Night's no time for pregnant women to be digging in graveyards," he said simply, "especially not alone." Rebecca's grip tightened on the shovel. "I don't need help." "Didn't offer any." Nathan shifted his weight hat, pulled low over his eyes. "Just making an observation." For a long moment, they remained frozen in their standoff. Rebecca with her shovel raised, Nathan watching with those quiet, assessing eyes. Then something in his posture changed, softened almost imperceptibly. "Town's 3 miles that way," he said, nodding eastward. "Though folks there aren't fond of nighttime visitors with secrets." Rebecca lowered the shovel, slightly wariness still evident in every line of her body. "How do you know I have secrets?" The corner of Nathan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Ma'am, people without secrets don't dig holes in graveyards at midnight." Despite herself, despite everything, Rebecca felt an unexpected urge to laugh, a bitter, desperate sound that died before it reached her lips. Instead, she swayed slightly, the exhaustion of weeks on the move suddenly washing over her. Nathan noticed. He always noticed. It was what had kept him alive through the war, this ability to read the subtle shifts in a person's bearing. He'd seen too many women collapse from exhaustion during those bloody years, wives searching for husbands among the wounded mothers burying sons. "My ranch is a mile west," he said, gesturing toward the low ridge silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Got a tack house. Clean, dry." He paused, then added with careful neutrality, "No questions asked." Rebecca stared at him, suspicion warring with bone-deep weariness. "Why would you help me?" Nathan's eyes drifted toward the small wooden marker at the edge of the cemetery, a crude cross with no name. Something passed across his face there and gone like a cloud before the wind. "Not offering help," he said. "Offering a roof." Different thing entirely. He turned and started walking away, boots silent on the packed earth. He didn't look back to see if she would follow. Didn't need to. Rebecca looked down at the half-dug hole at the small box that contained what remained of her past life. With a soft curse, she knelt awkwardly and placed the box in the shallow depression, then pushed dirt over it with trembling hands. Not deep enough to keep it safe forever, but enough to hide it from casual discovery. When she finally rose and turned, Nathan Caldwell's silhouette was just visible on the ridge, waiting. Not helping, just waiting. Rebecca pressed one hand to her belly, drew a deep breath, and began the slow walk toward that patient shadow. The sun rose mercilessly over Merrill Creek the following day, turning the dirt-packed street into a kiln. By mid-morning, the temperature had already climbed past 100 degrees heat, shimmering in waves that distorted the squat wooden buildings lining the town's single thoroughfare. Rebecca Harper walked slowly down that baking street, each step measured to conserve what little strength remained in her body. Her dress, faded to the color of old eggshells, clung damply to her back. Red dust coated her boots and the hem of her skirt. One hand cradled the swell of her belly. The other clutched a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, her worldly possessions reduced to what she could carry. She had left Nathan Caldwell's ranch before sunrise, slipping away while he was out checking his horses. The tack house had been exactly as he'd described, clean dry, with a pallet of fresh straw covered by a wool blanket. He'd left water and half a loaf of bread outside her door, but made no attempt to speak with her, after showing her the accommodations. The night's rest, brief as it was, had given her enough strength to continue her journey. Or so she'd thought. Now, as the heat beat down on her like a physical weight, Rebecca wasn't so certain. The town watched her progress with wary eyes. An old woman swept the boardwalk in front of the general store, her movements slowing as Rebecca passed. Two men paused their conversation outside the telegraph office, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. A deputy lounged in a chair tilted back against the saloon wall, his gaze following her without interest or compassion. They'd seen her kind before, women in trouble, carrying secrets and empty purses. Women who brought complications. Rebecca kept her chin up and her eyes forward, dignity wrapped around her like armor. She had a plan. The stagecoach station lay just ahead at the far end of town. If she could secure passage to Tucson, she might disappear among the larger population there. Start again. Find work before the baby came. The world tilted suddenly, buildings spinning around her like a carnival wheel. Rebecca stopped breath, catching in her throat as darkness edged her vision. Not now, she thought desperately. Not here. She took another step, fighting against the weakness spreading through her limbs, then another. The stagecoach station seemed to recede, stretching impossibly far away. The third step never landed. Her knees buckled, and she felt herself falling, the bundle slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. She didn't cry out, had forgotten how, perhaps. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was the impassive face of the deputy who hadn't bothered to rise from his chair. Nathan Caldwell stood in the doorway of Peterson's livery, watching the scene unfold across the street. He'd come to town for horseshoe nails and feed, not to witness the woman from last night collapse in the dust, like a marionette with cut strings. He'd known she would leave. Had expected it, in fact. People carrying secrets rarely stayed in one place long enough for those secrets to catch up with them. What he hadn't expected was the tightness in his chest when he saw her fall, or the way his body moved toward her before his mind had fully registered the decision. A brief memory flashed through his consciousness, not of the war this time, but of a small homestead in Illinois, and a young woman with honey-colored hair collapsed on the porch steps. His sister Charlotte, fevered and bleeding, after a difficult birth, calling a name he couldn't answer to. Nathan knelt beside Rebecca in the dust, aware of the town's eyes upon them, but caring little for their judgment. He set down the supplies he'd been carrying and unslung the canteen from his shoulder. Her face was pale beneath its coating of trail dust, lips cracked from dehydration. With practiced gentleness, he cradled the back of her head and lifted it slightly, bringing the canteen to her lips. "Drink," he said softly, not a command, but an offering. For several heartbeats, she remained still. Then her eyelids fluttered, pupils contracting against the harsh light. She coughed once, dry and painful, before her parched lips parted enough to accept a trickle of water. "No," she managed after a moment, weakly pushing the canteen away. "I don't need. Everyone needs water." Nathan interrupted, his voice matter-of-fact. "Even the stubborn ones." A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed her face. Good. Anger was fuel. Might keep her conscious long enough to get her out of this sun. Nathan recorked the canteen and surveyed their surroundings. The deputy had finally stood, though he remained on the boardwalk, watching with detached curiosity. Several townspeople had stopped to stare, though none approached to offer assistance. "Can you stand?" Nathan asked, returning his attention to Rebecca. She nodded, jaw set with determination that belied her weakened state. Nathan didn't offer his hand. Instead, he arranged his saddle upright beside her, a makeshift seat that would allow her to rise with some dignity intact. Rebecca pulled herself up with effort, one hand braced on the saddle, while the other remained protectively curved around her belly. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes had regained some clarity. "The stage," she said, glancing toward the station. "I need to—" "Stage left an hour ago," Nathan said. "Next one's not until tomorrow morning." Something like despair flickered in her eyes, quickly suppressed. Nathan recognized that look, had seen it in field hospitals and refugee camps. The expression of someone running out of options but too proud or too afraid to ask for help. He retrieved her fallen bundle and held it out to her without comment. She took it, clutching it against her side like a shield. "Dr. Caldwell," called a raspy voice from the boardwalk, "taking in strays again." Nathan turned to see Mrs. Abernathy, the widow who ran the boarding house, leaning on her broom with undisguised disapproval. Her use of his former title was deliberate, a reminder of a past he'd left behind. "Just offering a seat, Mrs. Abernathy," he replied evenly, "and some water on a hot day." The old woman sniffed. "Town ain't a charity ward." Her eyes narrowed as they settled on Rebecca. "Sheriff won't take kindly to vagrants, especially not her sort." Rebecca stiffened beside him, color rising in her pale cheeks. Before she could speak, Nathan straightened to his full height, shoulders squared. "Then it's fortunate she won't be staying in town," he said, his quiet tone carrying a steel edge that made the widow take a half-step back. "She'll be at my ranch until the stage comes through tomorrow." Mrs. Abernathy's mouth puckered like she'd bitten into something sour, but she didn't argue further. Few people in Merrill Creek cared to cross Nathan Caldwell. Not because he was violent, he'd never raised a hand to anyone in town, but because of the shadows behind his eyes. The kind of shadows that spoke of things seen that couldn't be unseen. Nathan gathered his supplies and nodded toward his horses, tethered outside the livery. "If you're coming, we should go before the heat gets worse." Rebecca hesitated, visibly calculating her limited options. Stay in a hostile town with no money and nowhere to sleep, or accept temporary shelter from a stranger who thus far had asked nothing in return. "I can pay my way," she said finally, voice low but firm. "I'm not looking for charity." Nathan's expression didn't change. "Never said you were." He turned and walked toward his horses, leaving her to follow or not, as she chose. After a moment's hesitation, Rebecca Harper gathered what remained of her strength and walked after him, head held high, despite the whispers that followed them down the street. The ride back to Nathan's ranch passed in silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats against packed earth. Rebecca sat atop Nathan's pack horse, a gentle mare with a white blaze down her muzzle. He'd insisted she ride not out of chivalry, but practicality. A woman in her condition, weakened by heat and hunger, would never make the 3-mile journey on foot. She'd stopped arguing after the first half-mile, when another wave of dizziness had nearly unseated her. Nathan had steadied her with a hand on her arm, then immediately withdrawn once she'd regained her balance. His touch had been impersonal, clinical almost. The touch of someone who had handled the ill and injured yet maintained a careful distance. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a modest spread nestled against the base of red rock cliffs that provided shade during the hottest part of the day. The main house was single-story, built of adobe, with a wooden porch wrapped around 2 sides. A barn stood nearby, its weathered boards bleached silver gray by years of sun. Beyond it lay 2 smaller outbuildings, a corral containing several horses, and a windmill that turned lazily in the afternoon breeze. It wasn't large or grand, but everything about it spoke of care and purpose. No peeling paint, no sagging fences, no broken windows. A place maintained by someone who respected the harsh land enough to prepare for its challenges. As they approached, Rebecca noticed a small garden beside the house, protected from the worst of the elements by a rough stone wall. Vegetables grew in neat rows, defying the desert's attempt to reclaim the cultivated earth. Near the edge of the property, just visible beyond the barn, stood 2 wooden crosses, the small cemetery she'd glimpsed when passing through last night. Nathan dismounted first, then stood beside Rebecca's horse. He didn't reach up to help her down, but remained there, ready if needed. Rebecca appreciated the gesture more than she could express this allowance of independence without abandonment of care. She slid from the saddle with as much grace as her condition permitted, steadying herself against the horse's warm flank as her feet touched ground. The world swam briefly, then steadied. "Tack house is there," Nathan said, nodding toward a small structure adjacent to the barn. "Roof's solid. Door's got a latch, but no lock. You'll have shade and water." Rebecca studied the building. It was simple but sturdy, with a small window and a door that faced away from the main house, offering privacy she hadn't expected. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, unable to keep the question contained any longer. In her experience, men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. Nathan adjusted his hat against the glare, his eyes moving toward the cemetery. "Got my reasons," he said after a moment. "None that concern you." Before she could press further, he turned and led the horses toward the barn. "Pump's there," he added, pointing to a well near the house. "Water's cool. Fill your canteen while you can." Rebecca watched him go, the set of his shoulders revealing nothing of his thoughts. After a moment, she moved toward the tack house, curiosity drawing her gaze to the cemetery at the property's edge. 2 crosses stood sentinel against the endless blue sky. One marker bore a name carved with careful precision, Emma Caldwell. The other remained unmarked, its weathered surface bearing mute testimony to someone who had passed beyond naming. The sight stirred something in Rebecca's chest, not quite fear, but a recognition. Whatever secrets Nathan Caldwell carried, they were buried as deeply as her own. The tack house was better than Rebecca had dared hope. Though small, barely 12 feet square, it was meticulously clean, the packed earth floor swept, and a braided rug laid in the center. A narrow cot stood against one wall, its frame hand-hewn but solid, with a straw-filled mattress covered by a wool blanket. A rough-hewn table and single chair occupied the opposite corner, while a small cast-iron stove provided means for heat and cooking. The window, though small, had been positioned to catch both morning light and afternoon shade. Someone had hung a square of muslin as a curtain offering privacy without sacrificing ventilation. A shelf beneath it held a basin and pitcher, a bar of yellow soap, and a folded towel that, while patched, was scrupulously clean. It was not luxury by any measure, but to Rebecca, who had spent weeks sleeping in barns and under wagons, it seemed an impossible comfort. She set her bundle on the table and sank onto the chair, body aching, with a weariness that seemed to reach her very bones. The baby shifted restlessly, a small foot or elbow pressing against her ribs. Rebecca placed a hand over the movement, a silent reassurance. "Just a little longer," she whispered, the promise she'd been making for months now. A promise that grew harder to believe with each passing day. A soft knock at the door startled her. Rebecca tensed, one hand instinctively reaching for the small knife hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Left some food by the door," came Nathan's voice, already retreating. "And clean water." By the time Rebecca crossed to the door and pulled it open, he was already halfway to the main house, his back to her. On the ground lay a covered plate, a jar of milk, and a full canteen. Rebecca stared at the offerings, something tight and painful squeezing her chest. It had been so long since someone had shown her basic kindness without demand or expectation that she'd almost forgotten how it felt. She gathered the items quickly and brought them inside, suddenly ravenous. The plate held beans, cornbread, and slices of dried apple, simple fare, but well prepared and more substantial than anything she'd eaten in days. As she ate, Rebecca considered her situation. One night of safety, then she would continue on tomorrow when the stage arrived. One night to rest, to gather her strength for whatever lay ahead. One night without fear. The thought brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, angry at her own weakness. Tears solved nothing, never had. After eating, Rebecca used some of the water to wash her face and hands, the simple act of cleanliness restoring a fragment of dignity the trail had stolen. Then, despite her intention to remain vigilant, she stretched out on the cot and fell into the first deep sleep she'd known in weeks. Nathan Caldwell sat on his porch as evening painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold. A half-carved piece of wood lay forgotten in his hands, the knife stilled mid-stroke. His eyes were fixed on the tack house, where no movement had been visible for hours. He should have left her in town, should have minded his own business as he'd done successfully for 5 years in this remote corner of the territory. Getting involved in other people's troubles was a sure path to finding more of his own. Yet when he'd seen her digging in the cemetery last night, something had shifted inside him, some long-dormant instinct awakening. Not compassion, exactly. He'd burned that out of himself long ago during the war. But recognition, perhaps. The sense of one wounded soul recognizing another. Nathan's gaze drifted to the small cemetery where Emma rested. He should visit tonight, clear away any weeds that had sprung up since his last tending. Tell her about the woman in the tack house, though he wasn't sure what he'd say. Emma had always been better with words than he was. Better with people, too. A soft sound drew his attention back to the present, the creak of the tack house door opening. Rebecca emerged, moving with the careful deliberation of someone still not fully recovered from exhaustion. She glanced toward the main house, tensing slightly when she saw him watching, then squared her shoulders and walked to the water pump. Nathan observed her without attempting to hide his scrutiny. She moved like someone accustomed to being watched, to being judged. Her spine remained straight, despite the weight she carried, her movements economical and purposeful. A woman who had learned to navigate a hostile world by making herself smaller, less noticeable, while refusing to be diminished. He recognized the type, had treated too many such women during the war, wives and daughters caught between opposing forces, trying to survive in a world that had ceased to acknowledge their humanity. Rebecca filled her canteen, then hesitated, glancing toward the small garden beside the house. After a moment's consideration, she walked toward it, examining the neat rows of vegetables with evident interest. "Help yourself," Nathan called, breaking his silence. "Got more than enough." She started at the sound of his voice, then turned to face him across the yard. The distance between them felt both physical and immeasurable. "I told you I can pay my way," she said, pride evident in the tilt of her chin. Nathan shrugged. "Wasn't offering charity, just vegetables." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, but after a moment she knelt awkwardly and began selecting a few ripe tomatoes and a handful of green beans. Her movements were practiced, a woman who knew gardens, who had tended them before. Nathan watched her gather the vegetables, noting the care she took not to damage the plants. Another piece of information filed away. Not a city woman, then. Someone raised with soil under her fingernails and an understanding of growing things. When she finished, Rebecca straightened with effort, one hand pressed against the small of her back. She looked toward Nathan again, hesitation visible in her posture. "Thank you," she said, finally, the words appearing to cost her something significant. Nathan nodded once, acknowledgement, rather than acceptance. He'd learned long ago that gratitude could become its own kind of bondage, a debt that some people felt compelled to repay regardless of the cost. "Stage comes through town around 9 tomorrow," he said, changing the subject. "I'll take you in if you want." Rebecca's expression tightened. "I can find my own way." "Never said you couldn't." Nathan set aside the forgotten carving and stood. "Offer stands if you change your mind." Without waiting for her response, he turned and entered the house, leaving her alone in the gathering dusk. Some decisions were best made without an audience. Inside his home, Nathan moved with the familiarity of long habit. The main room served multiple purposes, kitchen, dining area, and living space combined. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it remained unlit in the summer heat. Bookshelves lined another wall filled with medical texts, natural histories, and the few novels Emma had loved. He lit a lamp and set it on the table, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. Then he moved to a closed door near the back of the house, removed a key from his pocket, and unlocked it with practiced care. The room beyond was small, preserved like a museum exhibit. A narrow bed with a faded quilt. A dressing table with a silver-backed brush and hand mirror. A trunk at the foot of the bed, closed but not locked. Emma's room kept exactly as she had left it 4 years ago, when pneumonia had taken her in the space of a week. His fiancée, his childhood friend, the woman who had followed him west after the war, believing in his dream of a fresh start. Nathan didn't enter the shrine-like space. He simply stood in the doorway, as he did each evening, acknowledging its existence and the absence it represented. Then he closed the door and locked it again, returning the key to his pocket. Some wounds never fully healed. You just learn to carry them without bleeding out. He crossed to another door, this one leading to his own Spartan quarters. A bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand. Nothing personal, nothing that spoke of the man who slept there. Just functional items for basic needs. From beneath the bed, Nathan pulled out a battered leather medical bag, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. He hadn't opened it in months, not since setting Mrs. Peterson's broken arm last winter. The tools inside represented a life he'd walked away from, a calling he'd abandoned when it had failed him and Emma most critically. Still, habit and training demanded he check the contents. If the woman in his tack house took a turn for the worse, if the child decided to come early, Nathan opened the bag, surveying the instruments within. Forceps, scalpels, suture needles, catgut. bottles of carbolic acid, laudanum quinine. The tools of a trade he'd once practiced with confidence before doubt had hollowed him out from within. He closed the bag without removing anything and slid it back under the bed. Better to take her to town if complications arose. Better to place that responsibility in someone else's hands. A soft sound from outside drew him to the window. The melody of a harmonica played with surprising skill. Nathan parted the curtain slightly, looking out toward the tack house. Rebecca sat on the small bench outside her temporary lodging, face tilted toward the star-strewn sky as her fingers moved over the instrument. The tune was melancholy, speaking of longing and loss in a way words seldom could. Another piece of information, another glimpse beneath the armor she wore so carefully. Nathan let the curtain fall back into place and moved away from the window, unwilling to intrude further on what was clearly a private moment. As he prepared for sleep, the haunting melody continued weaving through the night air like a spirit seeking rest. It followed him into uneasy dreams, where Emma's face blurred with that of his sister Charlotte, and both called to him from beyond a divide he could not cross. Dawn found Rebecca already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, as she contemplated the day ahead. Sleep had come in fitful bursts, disturbed by the child's restless movements and dreams that left her heart racing upon waking. Today, she would board the stage to Tucson, using the last of her carefully hoarded money for passage. What would happen after that remained uncertain, a question she pushed aside whenever it arose. One step at a time, one day at a time. That was how survival worked. She gathered her few possessions, folding the threadbare dress and worn shawl into her bundle alongside the harmonica that had been her father's. The instrument was perhaps the only thing of value she owned, yet she'd never considered selling it, even in her most desperate moments. Some anchors to the past were worth their weight. A soft knock at the door interrupted her preparations. Rebecca tensed, then forced herself to relax. If Nathan Caldwell had meant her harm, he'd had ample opportunity during the night. She opened the door to find a covered plate on the ground, steam rising from beneath the cloth that covered it. Beside it sat a cup of coffee, still hot enough to send tendrils of vapor into the cool morning air. Nathan himself was nowhere in sight, though sounds of activity came from the barn. Rebecca brought the breakfast inside, discovering eggs, bacon, and more of the cornbread from yesterday. Simple food, but prepared with care. As she ate, Rebecca considered the man who had, for reasons she still didn't understand, offered her sanctuary. Nathan Caldwell was a puzzle, a former doctor who now raised horses in the middle of nowhere. A man who kept one room perpetually locked, who visited a small cemetery each evening as darkness fell. A solitary figure who nevertheless maintained a garden large enough to feed several people and who had a tack house clean and ready for unexpected guests. A man with secrets just as she had. Rebecca finished her meal and stepped outside the morning sun, already warming the air despite the early hour. Nathan stood by the corral, watching as a young colt pranced around its mother. He turned at the sound of her approach, his expression as unreadable as ever. "I've decided to take you up on your offer," Rebecca said without preamble, "for the ride to town." Nathan nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing else. "Leaving in an hour," he replied. "Need to deliver a horse to the blacksmith while I'm there." Rebecca glanced toward the house, then back to Nathan. "I'd like to repay your hospitality," she said formally, "for the food and lodging." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Nathan's eyes. "Got money to spare for the stage fare and extra for payment?" Rebecca stiffened. "I don't accept charity. And I don't offer it." Nathan turned his attention back to the horses. "You want to repay something, gather eggs from the coop behind the house. 6 hens. Should be at least 4 eggs. I'll cook them when I get back from town." Rebecca blinked, momentarily thrown by the practical request. "You're assuming I'll still be here when you return." Nathan shrugged, not looking at her. "Assuming nothing. Just telling you where the eggs are if you're still around to gather them." He walked away, then heading toward the barn without a backward glance. Rebecca stared after him, frustration and confusion warring within her. Every conversation with this man left her off balance, uncertain of where they stood. With a soft huff of annoyance, she turned and walked toward the chicken coop, determined to at least discharge this small debt before leaving. The stage wouldn't arrive for hours yet. Gathering eggs was a simple enough task, one that required no commitment beyond the moment. As she collected the warm eggs, careful not to disturb the hens more than necessary, Rebecca found herself cataloging details of the ranch with an attention born of long practice. The layout of buildings that provided maximum shade throughout the day. The garden positioned to catch runoff from the windmill. The way the house had been built into the sloping land using the earth's natural insulation against temperature extremes. Someone had planned this place with intelligence and foresight. Someone who understood that survival in this harsh landscape required more than just endurance, it required adaptation. By the time Nathan emerged from the barn leading a saddled horse, Rebecca had gathered the eggs, refilled her canteen, and repacked her bundle. She stood waiting by the tack house, prepared for departure. Nathan mounted without speaking, then extended a hand toward her, not an invitation but offering practical assistance. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before accepting the help, allowing him to pull her up behind him on the horse's broad back. "Hold on," he said, the first words he'd spoken since their earlier exchange. Rebecca placed her hands lightly on his waist, maintaining as much distance as the shared saddle allowed. As they set off toward town, she kept her gaze fixed on the trail ahead, trying to ignore the unfamiliar intimacy of riding double with a stranger. Yet, as the miles passed beneath the horse's steady hooves, Rebecca found herself noticing things she hadn't during yesterday's journey. The way Nathan automatically adjusted his posture to accommodate her weight and balance. The careful pace he set, neither too jarring nor too slow. The subtle guidance he provided when they traversed rougher terrain, a hand briefly covering hers to indicate when to lean or shift. Small considerations that spoke of awareness of care, taken without drawing attention to itself. By the time they reached the outskirts of Merrill Creek, Rebecca had revised her assessment of Nathan Caldwell yet again. Whatever his secrets, whatever shadows haunted his eyes, he was a man who paid attention to details, who saw needs without requiring them to be voiced. In her experience, such men were rare indeed. The stagecoach station in Merrill Creek consisted of a single room attached to the general store with a covered platform where passengers could wait out of the direct sun. As Nathan and Rebecca arrived, the platform stood empty, save for a single figure, a well-dressed man in a black suit and bowler hat, looking decidedly out of place in the dusty frontier town. Nathan felt Rebecca stiffen behind him, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on his waist. He slowed the horse, assessing the stranger with the automatic wariness of someone who had learned to identify threats at a distance. The man was tall and lean, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His suit, though dusty from travel, was of good quality, as were his polished boots. A watch chain glinted against his vest, and a ring with some kind of seal adorned one manicured hand. Not a typical traveler on this remote stage line, not a typical visitor to Merrill Creek. "Know him?" Nathan asked quietly, pitching his voice so only Rebecca could hear. "No," she replied, but the tension in her body told a different story. Nathan didn't press. Everyone had the right to their own secrets, their own fears. He guided the horse toward the hitch rail on the opposite side of the street, positioning it so that the animal's bulk provided some concealment for Rebecca as she dismounted. "Stage is late," he observed, scanning the empty road that led into town. "Probably won't be here for another hour if it's coming at all." Rebecca glanced toward the waiting stranger, then back to Nathan. "I should get a ticket," she said, voice steadier than her pale face suggested. Nathan nodded. "I'll see to the horse, then join you." It wasn't an offer of protection, not exactly, but the slight relaxation of Rebecca's shoulders suggested she understood the implicit support. As she crossed the street, head held high, despite her obvious unease, Nathan led his horse toward the water trough. From this position he could observe both Rebecca and the stranger without being obvious about his scrutiny. The man in the bowler hat looked up as Rebecca approached the station door. For a moment, he showed no reaction. Then his posture changed, a sudden alertness that reminded Nathan of a hunting dog catching a scent. "Mrs. Richardson," the man called, stepping forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rebecca Richardson." Rebecca froze, one hand instinctively moving to her belly in a protective gesture. "I'm sorry," she said, voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. "You're mistaken. My name is Harper." The man's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect to be anything but false. "I'm afraid there's no mistake, Mrs. Richardson. I'm Ezra Hammond, attorney for the Richardson family." He tipped his bowler hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. "I've been looking for you for quite some time." Nathan tensed, hand dropping to rest on the knife at his belt. Not reaching for it, not yet, but ready. Rebecca straightened her spine, facing the attorney with a composure that spoke of practice in difficult situations. "As I said, my name is Harper. Rebecca Harper. I've never heard of any Richardson family." Hammond chuckled, the sound devoid of genuine amusement. "Come now, Mrs. Richardson. Your husband Thomas may have met an unfortunate end, but his family still considers you and your unborn child very much their concern." A muscle twitched in Rebecca's jaw, the only visible sign of emotion. "My husband is dead. I owe his family nothing." "On the contrary." Hammond withdrew a folded document from his coat pocket. "As Thomas's widow, you are entitled to certain provisions, and the child you carry, the Richardson heir, is of particular interest to the family." Rebecca's face had gone completely white, but her voice remained steady. "The child is mine. Mine alone." Hammond's expression hardened. "I'm afraid the law disagrees, as does the Richardson family. They're prepared to be quite generous, provided you return with me to San Francisco and allow them to ensure proper care for both you and the child." Nathan had heard enough. He secured his horse and crossed the street, moving with the quiet purpose that had once carried him through battlefield hospitals. He positioned himself beside Rebecca, not touching her but close enough to provide a physical barrier between her and the attorney. "Lady said she's not interested," he stated, voice low but carrying a weight of authority that came from years of giving orders in chaotic situations. Hammond's gaze flicked to Nathan, dismissing him after a cursory assessment. "This is a private matter, sir. I suggest you continue about your business." "My business is here," Nathan replied evenly, "and it seems to me the lady has made her position clear." A flash of annoyance crossed Hammond's face, quickly masked by professional smoothness. "And you are someone who believes people should be allowed to make their own choices." Nathan didn't offer his name. Names had power, could be recorded, tracked, used. The attorney studied him more carefully this time, noting the breadth of his shoulders, the stillness of his stance, the weathered hands that spoke of both physical labor and more delicate work. "I see," Hammond said finally. "Well, perhaps Mrs. Richardson would prefer to discuss her options privately. The stage won't arrive for some time yet, I'm told." Rebecca's hand found Nathan's arm, fingers gripping with surprising strength. "I have nothing to discuss with you, or the Richardson family," she said firmly. "Please leave me alone." Hammond sighed as if dealing with a particularly difficult child. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. The family is quite determined to locate their grandchild. They've hired several associates to assist in the search." He glanced meaningfully down the street where two rough-looking men had appeared outside the saloon, watching their exchange with undisguised interest. Nathan recognized the type immediately. Hired muscle, probably former soldiers or cowboys, fallen on hard times. Men who would do unpleasant work for the right price, without asking too many questions. "How fortunate that I found you first," Hammond continued smoothly. "My employers would prefer to resolve this matter quietly, without any unpleasantness." The threat, though veiled, hung in the air between them. Nathan felt a familiar calm settling over him, the detached focus that had carried him through amputations, under artillery fire, through makeshift surgeries in blood-soaked field tents. A state where emotions receded and only the problem at hand remained. "Stage isn't coming today," he said, decision made. "Track washout 10 miles south. Just got word." The lie came easily born of necessity rather than habit. Hammond frowned. "I was assured—" "Dispatch rider came through an hour ago," Nathan interrupted. "Stage is delayed until tomorrow at least, maybe longer." He turned to Rebecca, who was watching him with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "We should head back. No sense waiting here all day." Rebecca understood immediately, nodding with just the right amount of disappointment. "Yes, I suppose we should." Hammond's expression darkened. "Mrs. Richardson will be coming with me," he stated, all pretense of courtesy abandoned. "The family has authorized me to take whatever steps necessary to ensure her cooperation." Nathan stepped forward, placing himself more directly between Rebecca and the attorney. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Hammond." "Merely a statement of fact." Hammond gestured subtly toward the men outside the saloon who had begun moving in their direction. "I have the law on my side as well as resources you clearly lack. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." For a long moment the two men stared at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken violence. Then Nathan smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "You know what's interesting about frontier towns, Mr. Hammond?" he asked conversationally. "Everyone knows everyone else's business, especially the doctor's business." Hammond blinked, momentarily thrown by the apparent non sequitur. "I fail to see those men you hired," Nathan continued, nodding toward the approaching thugs. "The one on the left, Miller, I treated him for a bullet wound last winter. Saved his arm. The one on the right, Jackson, I delivered his sister's baby 2 years back. Complicated birth. Mother and child both lived." Understanding dawned on Hammond's face. "You're the doctor. Caldwell." "Was a doctor," Nathan corrected. "Still remember enough to be useful when needed." He raised a hand in greeting to the two men who had slowed their approach, recognition evident in their expressions. "Doc," acknowledged the larger of the two, tipping his hat respectfully. "Didn't know you were involved in this." Nathan's smile remained fixed in place. "The lady is under my protection, Miller. Temporarily." Miller and his companion exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Mr. Hammond here paying you well?" Nathan asked casually. Miller shrugged. "Well enough." "I'll double it," Nathan offered. "If you'll escort him back to wherever he came from and explain that Mrs. Harper isn't interested in his proposition." Hammond's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. You can't possibly—" "Can and am," Nathan interrupted. "Way I see it, you have two choices. Leave peacefully on the next stage out, or leave less peacefully with these gentlemen's assistants. Either way, you're leaving without Mrs. Harper." The attorney looked from Nathan to the two hired men, who now stood with arms crossed, waiting for his decision. Whatever he saw in their faces made him reconsider his options. "This isn't over," Hammond said, finally gathering what dignity remained to him. "The Richardson family won't be deterred so easily. They want their grandchild, and they have the means to ensure they get what they want." "Perhaps," Nathan acknowledged, "but not today." Hammond straightened his jacket, glaring at Miller and his companion. "You'll regret this betrayal," he promised. "Both of you." Miller spat into the dust. "Reckon I've survived worse than a fancy lawyer's tantrums." With a final glare at Rebecca, Hammond turned and stalked toward the hotel, his rigid posture broadcasting his fury with every step. Nathan watched him go, then turned to the hired men. "My thanks," he said simply, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing several coins. "For your trouble." Miller accepted the payment with a nod. "Least we could do, Doc, after what you did for my arm." He glanced at Rebecca curiously. "This lady really worth crossing someone like Hammond?" "Not your concern," Nathan replied, not unkindly. "But I'd appreciate it if you'd make sure he leaves on tomorrow's stage." The men nodded their agreement and retreated toward the saloon, leaving Nathan and Rebecca alone in the suddenly quiet street. Rebecca's face was still pale, but a hint of color had returned to her cheeks. "That was—" she began, then stopped, apparently unable to find adequate words. "Effective," Nathan supplied. "For now." He glanced toward the hotel where Hammond had disappeared. "But he's right about one thing. This isn't over." Rebecca's hand moved protectively over her belly. "No," she agreed softly. "It isn't." Nathan studied her for a moment, seeing the fear she tried to hide beneath her composed exterior. "We should go," he said finally, before he decides to try a different approach. "Go where?" Rebecca asked, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. "The stage isn't coming. I can't stay in town. I can't—" "Back to the ranch," Nathan interrupted. "For now, until we figure out a better plan." Rebecca searched his face, looking for something ulterior motives perhaps, or signs of deception. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because after a moment she nodded. "For now," she echoed the words both acceptance and limitation. Nathan offered his hand, helping her mount behind him once more. As they rode out of town, he felt her trembling against his back reaction, setting in now that the immediate danger had passed. He didn't comment on it, didn't offer empty reassurances, or press for explanations. Some truths emerged only when ready, like seedlings breaking through soil in their own time. Instead, he guided the horse homeward at a steady pace, his thoughts already turning to preparations. Hammond would return, or others like him would come. The Richardson family, whoever they were, clearly had resources and determination, which meant he and Rebecca needed to be ready when they came. Ready and, perhaps, a step ahead. The sun hung low on the horizon by the time they returned to the ranch, painting the adobe walls of the house in shades of gold and amber. Nathan had maintained a careful pace throughout the journey, mindful of Rebecca's condition and the heat of the day. They had stopped twice to rest in whatever shade they could find, drinking sparingly from the canteen shared between them. During those pauses, neither had spoken of what had transpired in town. Rebecca sat with her back against a rock or tree, eyes closed as if gathering strength. Nathan checked the horse, scanned their surroundings, and kept his own counsel. The questions would come later. For now, survival took precedence over explanations. As they approached the ranch, Rebecca stirred behind him, straightening from the slight slump she had fallen into during the final miles. "I need to tell you," she began, voice low and measured. "About Hammond. About the Richardsons." Nathan shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he replied. "Rest first. Food. Then talk." He felt, rather than saw, her nod of agreement, her forehead briefly touching his shoulder, in a gesture of either gratitude or simple exhaustion. Either way, it spoke of a trust he wasn't certain he deserved. They dismounted near the barn, Rebecca moving with the careful deliberation of someone conserving limited energy. Nathan led the horse inside, removing saddle and bridle with practiced efficiency before returning to find Rebecca still standing where he'd left her, gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Something coming?" he asked, following her line of sight. Rebecca shook her head slowly. "No, just remembering." She turned to face him, shadows gathering in her eyes as the day's light faded. "Why did you help me the truth this time?" Nathan considered his response carefully, weighing truth against privacy. "Everyone deserves a choice," he said finally. Hammond wasn't offering one. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Just a fragment of a larger picture he wasn't ready to reveal in its entirety. Rebecca studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the choice." Before Nathan could respond, she turned and walked toward the tack house, back straight, despite the weariness evident in every line of her body. He watched her go, struck by the resilience that kept her moving forward when most would have collapsed under the weight of circumstances. Inside the main house, Nathan moved methodically through his evening routine. He stoked the stove, put water on to boil, and began preparing a simple meal from the supplies on hand. Beans, salt pork, the last of yesterday's cornbread. Nothing fancy, but filling and nourishing. As he worked, his mind circled back to the confrontation in town. Hammond had been too confident, too certain of his position. The kind of certainty that came from money and influence, the kind that didn't acknowledge failure as a possibility. The Richardson family, whoever they were, clearly had both in abundance, which meant they wouldn't stop with one failed attempt to retrieve Rebecca and her unborn child. Nathan's hands stilled over the pot he was stirring. Her unborn child. The Richardson heir, Hammond had called it. Yet Rebecca had denied any connection to the family, had insisted the child was hers alone. Another piece of the puzzle, another shadow to navigate in the growing darkness. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Nathan wiped his hands on a cloth and crossed the room, surprised to find Rebecca standing on his porch face, composed, but eyes revealing the cost of that composure. "I promised an explanation," she said without preamble, "and you deserve one after what happened today." Nathan stepped back, opening the door wider in silent invitation. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before entering her gaze, moving around the room with the automatic assessment of someone accustomed to cataloging exits and potential weapons. "Sit," Nathan said, gesturing toward the table. "Food's almost ready." Rebecca perched on the edge of a chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I'm not who Hammond thinks I am." She began watching as Nathan returned to the stove. "Or rather, I am, but not in the way he believes." Nathan nodded, allowing her to proceed at her own pace as he dished beans into 2 bowls. "I was married to Thomas Richardson," Rebecca continued, voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "For 8 months. He died 6 weeks ago in a raid on the freight caravan he was traveling with." She accepted the bowl Nathan placed before her with a murmured thanks, but made no move to eat. "His family is influential. Banking interests in San Francisco, mining operations throughout the territory. Thomas was their only son, their heir. Rebecca's hand moved to her belly in what appeared to be an unconscious gesture. When they learned I was carrying his child, they sent Hammond to find me, to bring me back to San Francisco, where they could ensure the baby would be raised as a proper Richardson. Nathan sat across from her, his own food momentarily forgotten. "And you ran." It wasn't a question, but Rebecca nodded anyway. They wanted to control me, to dictate how I lived, how the child would be raised. Thomas's mother made it very clear that while they needed me, until the birth afterward, she trailed off, the implication clear. Afterward she would become irrelevant. A necessary vessel, nothing more. "So you disappeared?" Nathan concluded. "Changed your name back to Harper. Headed east instead of west." "Yes." Rebecca finally picked up her spoon, stirring the beans without eating. "I thought if I could reach Tucson, then perhaps continue on to Texas or Louisiana, I could disappear completely. Start over somewhere they wouldn't think to look." "Why not tell Hammond the truth?" Nathan asked. "That you don't want their interference, their control." Rebecca's laugh held no humor. "The Richardsons don't accept refusal, Dr. Caldwell. They're accustomed to getting what they want by whatever means necessary." Her eyes met his, unflinching. "Thomas taught me that lesson quite thoroughly during our marriage." Understanding dawned cold and clarifying. "He hurt you." Rebecca's gaze dropped to her bowl. "Not in ways that left visible marks. Thomas preferred subtler methods: isolation, manipulation, control." She drew a deep breath. The perfect Richardson heir, groomed from birth to continue the family legacy. Nathan felt a familiar anger stirring, the same righteous fury that had driven him through battlefields and field hospitals confronting suffering he could sometimes ease, but never fully eliminate. "The box," he said, suddenly remembering their first encounter. "In the cemetery. What was in it?" Rebecca looked up, surprise briefly replacing the shadow in her eyes. "Evidence," she replied after a moment. "Letters Thomas wrote to his mistress detailing his plans to leave me once certain business arrangements were complete. Records of transactions he hid from his family, deals that would have ruined them if made public." "Insurance," Nathan concluded. Rebecca nodded. "I found them after his death, hidden in a false bottom of his traveling case. I thought—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "I thought they might protect me if the Richardsons ever found me. A form of mutually assured destruction." "But you buried them." "I panicked when I saw you," Rebecca admitted. "Thought you might be working for the family. Better to hide the evidence than have it taken from me." Nathan considered this new information, fitting it into the pattern gradually taking shape. "You'll need to retrieve it," he said finally. "Tomorrow, when it's safe." Rebecca's expression reflected surprise again, perhaps, at his acceptance of her story, perhaps at his practical response to it. "You believe me?" she said, the words half question, half statement. "No reason not to," Nathan replied simply. He nodded toward her untouched food. "Eat, then rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to decide next steps." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher some hidden message in his neutral expression. Then, with a small nod of acknowledgement, she began to eat. They finished the meal in silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. When Rebecca had eaten as much as she could manage, she rose to help clear the table, but Nathan waved her back to her seat. "One more question," he said, setting the dishes in a basin of water. "The child. Hammond called it the Richardson heir." Rebecca's hand moved to her belly again, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. "That's what they believe," she said softly. "What Thomas believed." Nathan turned to face her, understanding the implication immediately. But it's not true. Rebecca met his gaze steadily, chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. No, she confirmed. It's not. Outside, the last light faded from the western sky, leaving the world in darkness pierced only by stars and the soft glow of the lamp on the table between them. Some secrets, it seemed, were better revealed in the dark. Morning arrived with the harsh clarity peculiar to desert landscapes. Light spilled across the land in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows behind every rock and scrub brush. The air remained cool, a brief reprieve before the sun climbed higher and scorched away any memory of night's mercy. Rebecca stood on the porch of the tack house, watching as the world transformed around her. Sleep had come in fitful bursts, disturbed by the child's restless movements and dreams that faded upon waking, leaving only a sense of dread in their wake. Yet, despite her exhaustion, she felt strangely calm, the calm that comes after making a decision when all options seem equally fraught. She had told Nathan Caldwell the truth. Not all of it, not yet. But enough that he understood the danger Hammond represented, enough that he could make an informed choice about whether to continue offering shelter. The fact that he hadn't immediately withdrawn that offer upon learning of her deception spoke to something in his character Rebecca hadn't encountered often in her life, a capacity for understanding that transcended conventional judgment. Movement from the main house caught her attention. Nathan emerged, hat already in place against the morning sun, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. He paused when he saw her watching, then altered his course to approach the tack house. "Going to check the south fence line," he said without preamble. "Won't be back till midday." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the statement for what it was, not just information, but a promise of temporary privacy. Time for her to consider her next move without his presence adding pressure to her deliberations. "The cemetery," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I should retrieve the box before someone else finds it." Nathan studied her for a moment, assessing her strength against the task she proposed. "Can you ride?" "Yes." Rebecca answered, somewhat surprised by the question. "Not well, but enough to stay on a gentle mount." "Take the mare," Nathan said, nodding toward the barn. "Dulcie, bay with a white blaze. She'll carry you safely there and back." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small key, holding it out to her. "Tack room's locked. This opens it. Saddle's on the wall to the right." Rebecca accepted the key, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Thank you." Nathan adjusted his hat, eyes shifting toward the horizon. "Be careful," he said simply. "Hammond may still be in town." With that, he turned and strode toward the corral, where a dun gelding waited already saddled. Rebecca watched him mount and ride out, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast landscape until he disappeared beyond a distant ridge. Only then did she allow herself to release the breath she'd been holding, shoulders slumping slightly as the tension she'd maintained in his presence ebbed away. Trust came neither easily nor quickly to Rebecca Harper. Too many lessons taught in pain and betrayal stood between her and any simple acceptance of kindness. Yet something about Nathan Caldwell's straightforward manner, his lack of demands or expectations, made her want to believe his help came without hidden cost. A dangerous inclination, perhaps, one she couldn't afford to indulge without caution. With renewed determination, Rebecca returned inside to prepare for her journey. The box needed to be recovered. Beyond that, decisions could wait. One step at a time. One day at a time. The familiar mantra steadied her as she gathered what she would need for the ride ahead. The mare proved to be exactly as Nathan had described, gentle and sure-footed, responding to even Rebecca's inexperienced guidance with patient accommodation. The journey to the cemetery passed without incident, the landscape rolling by in an endless panorama of reds and browns, punctuated by the occasional splash of green where moisture gathered near the surface. Rebecca dismounted awkwardly at the cemetery's edge, tethering Dulcie to a stunted juniper before making her way among the weathered markers. Most bore names long forgotten by all but their descendants' dates, spanning the territory's brief history of white settlement. A few newer graves stood out, their earth still darker than the surrounding soil. The spot where she had buried the box lay near the eastern edge beneath the spreading branches of a cottonwood tree. Rebecca knelt carefully, mindful of her growing belly, and began to dig with the small trowel she'd brought from Nathan's garden shed. The soil yielded easily, still loose from her previous excavation. Within minutes, her fingers brushed against smooth wood. She worked more carefully, then clearing away the remaining dirt until she could lift the box free. It was a simple thing, a cigar box reinforced with brass corner pieces, its surface darkened with age and handling. Inside lay documents that could destroy the Richardson family's reputation and business interests if made public. Letters written in Thomas's meticulous hand, detailing fraudulent business practices and arrangements with figures whose names never appeared in respectable newspapers. Records of bribes paid to officials of competitors, ruined through deliberate sabotage. And the most damning of all correspondence with a woman in San Francisco outlining his plan to abandon his tedious wife once certain financial matters were settled, ensuring that none of his family's wealth would follow her when he left. Insurance, Rebecca had called it when explaining to Nathan, a shield against the Richardson family's reach. Yet, holding the box now, feeling its weight in her hands, she wondered if it was truly protection or simply another burden to carry, another chain binding her to a past she desperately wanted to escape. With a sigh, she tucked the box into the saddlebag and rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her skirt. As she did, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze, heart suddenly pounding in her chest. Rebecca scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing against the bright morning light. A single rider approached from the direction of town, still too distant to identify clearly. But something in the rigid posture, the formal riding style, sent a chill down her spine. Hammond. Moving with as much speed as her condition allowed, Rebecca untied Dulcie and mounted, turning the mare's head toward the ranch. She wouldn't reach it before Hammond intercepted her. The approaching rider had already altered course upon spotting her, but she might reach the ridge where Nathan had disappeared earlier. Dulcie seemed to sense her urgency, picking up pace without need for encouragement. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, one hand on the reins while the other rested protectively over her belly. The child shifted restlessly, responding to her increased heartbeat with its own agitated movements. "Just hold on," Rebecca whispered, as much to herself as to the unborn child. "Just a little longer." The distance between them and the approaching rider narrowed with each passing moment. Close enough now that Rebecca could confirm her fear. It was indeed Ezra Hammond, his black suit and bowler hat incongruous against the natural landscape. He rode with the stiff precision of a man accustomed to city streets rather than open country, but determination was evident in every line of his posture. Rebecca urged Dulcie to greater speed, though she knew the mare couldn't sustain a gallop for long, especially with her inexpert guidance. The ridge that marked the boundary of Nathan's property loomed ahead, still too distant for comfort. Hammond was gaining ground, his mount fresher, and his riding skills, while unnatural, sufficient to close the gap between them. Rebecca heard him call her name, the sound carried on the wind that whipped past her ears. "Mrs. Richardson, stop this foolishness at once!" She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his command. All her focus remained on the ridge ahead, on the slim hope that Nathan might be within earshot, if she could just get close enough. The mare's breathing grew labored as the ground began to slope upward. Rebecca felt a stab of guilt for pushing the gentle animal, but fear drove her forward. Not fear for herself, she had faced worse than Ezra Hammond in her life, but for her child. For the future, she was determined to provide, free from the Richardson family's influence and control. Hammond drew alongside her just as they crested the first rise, his horse cutting off Dulcie's path with practiced precision. The mare halted, sides heaving, as Hammond's mount danced sideways to block any further progress. "Enough of this, Mrs. Richardson," Hammond said, voice tight with controlled anger. "You've led me on quite a chase, but it ends here." Rebecca straightened in the saddle, chin lifting in the gesture of defiance that had become second nature during her marriage to Thomas. "My name is Harper," she stated coldly, "and I have no business with you or the Richardsons." Hammond's lips curved in a smile devoid of warmth. "Your stubbornness is becoming tiresome. The Richardson family has been more than patient, more than generous in their offer." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document. "I have here a court order granting temporary guardianship of your unborn child to Mr. and Mrs. Elias Richardson, pending formal arrangements after the birth." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face, though she maintained her outward composure through sheer force of will. "On what grounds?" "Mental instability," Hammond replied smoothly. "Abandonment of family responsibilities. Flight from legitimate authority." His smile widened slightly. "Your behavior since Thomas's death has provided ample evidence for such claims, I'm afraid." The casual cruelty of it, the calculated manipulation of law to serve wealth and power, was so familiar that Rebecca almost laughed. Thomas had employed similar tactics throughout their marriage, using his family's influence to isolate her to ensure that any complaint she might raise would fall on deaf ears. "The document is worthless," she said finally, voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "It was obtained under false pretenses, with false information." Hammond shrugged, returning the paper to his pocket. "Perhaps, but it will serve its purpose until the matter can be properly adjudicated in San Francisco before judges well acquainted with the Richardson family's standing in the community." He extended his hand. "Now, shall we proceed to town? I've arranged suitable accommodations until we can secure passage west." Rebecca stared at his outstretched hand, feeling the walls closing in around her, just as they had during those suffocating months of marriage. The familiar sensation of helplessness threatened to overwhelm her, to crush the hard-won independence she had fought for since fleeing the Richardson household. "No," she said, the word emerging with quiet force. "I will not go with you." Hammond's expression hardened. "I'm afraid you have no choice in the matter, Mrs. Richardson. If you won't come willingly, I am authorized to employ whatever methods necessary to ensure your cooperation." His hand moved toward his coat again, but before he could withdraw whatever threat it contained, a sharp voice cut through the tense silence. "That sounds remarkably like another threat, Mr. Hammond." Nathan Caldwell sat atop his gelding on the ridge above them, rifle balanced casually across his thighs. How long he had been there observing their confrontation, Rebecca couldn't guess. But the sight of him sent a wave of relief through her body so powerful she had to grip the saddle horn to remain upright. Hammond turned slowly, his face betraying momentary surprise, before settling back into practiced neutrality. "Dr. Caldwell, I was under the impression you had business elsewhere today." "Finished early," Nathan replied, guiding his mount down the slope with unhurried confidence. He stopped when he drew even with Rebecca, positioning himself slightly ahead of her mare. "Found some things that needed my attention closer to home." His eyes met Rebecca's briefly, a silent question in their gray depths. She gave a small nod, answering without words. Yes, she had recovered the box. Yes, she was unharmed. Hammond watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "This doesn't concern you, Doctor." It's a legal matter between Mrs. Richardson and her late husband's family. Seems to concern me plenty, Nathan responded mildly, considering your trespassing on my land threatening a guest under my protection. A muscle twitched in Hammond's jaw. I have legal authority. Not in this county, you don't. Nathan's tone remained conversational, though his hand rested with casual readiness near the rifle on his lap. Judge Franklin might recognize San Francisco court orders, but he generally takes a dim view of outsiders, trying to enforce them without his approval. He smiled slightly, particularly when they involve coercing women in a delicate condition. Hammond's gaze flickered between Nathan and Rebecca, reassessing his position. After a moment, he straightened in his saddle, attempting to reclaim some measure of dignity. Very well. We'll do this properly through local channels. His eyes hardened as they settled on Rebecca. But make no mistake, Mrs. Richardson. The family will not rest until they secure what is rightfully theirs. You would be wise to consider their offer while it remains generous. Nathan shifted his weight slightly, drawing Hammond's attention. Threatening a lady isn't considered gentlemanly behavior in these parts, Mr. Hammond. His voice had dropped to a lower register, carrying an unmistakable warning despite its even tone. Might want to keep that in mind during your stay in our county. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the air between them charged with potential violence. Then Hammond nodded stiffly, gathering his reins. We'll continue this discussion at a more appropriate time, he said, directing the comment toward Rebecca. Good day to you both. With a final sharp glance at Nathan, Hammond turned his horse and rode back toward town, his rigid posture betraying his tightly contained anger. Rebecca released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, shoulders slumping slightly as tension drained from her body. Thank you, she said softly, the words inadequate for the magnitude of her relief. Nathan watched Hammond's retreating figure until it disappeared beyond a rise, then turned his attention to Rebecca. His eyes moved over her with quick assessment, noting the pallor of her skin and the slight tremor in her hands. Got what you came for? He asked, nodding toward the saddlebag where the box was concealed. Rebecca nodded. Yes. Good. Nathan gestured toward the ranch, now visible in the distance. Let's get back. Hammond won't give up that easily, but he'll need time to regroup. As they rode side by side, Rebecca found herself studying Nathan's profile, trying to reconcile the quiet rancher with the man who had just faced down Ezra Hammond with such calculated confidence. There was more to Nathan Caldwell than he revealed, layers beneath the taciturn exterior that she was only beginning to glimpse. How did you know? She asked finally. That I was in trouble. Nathan's gaze remained on the horizon. Saw Hammond ride out of town this morning, heading this way. Figured he might have guessed where you'd go. A pause, then doubled back to make sure he didn't find you alone. The simple explanation contained volumes unspoken awareness, consideration, protective instinct, engaged without expectation of gratitude or reward. In Rebecca's experience, such qualities in men were rare indeed. The court order he mentioned, she said, changing the subject to the more pressing concern. Can he enforce it here? Nathan considered the question with characteristic thoroughness before answering. Not immediately. Local judge would need to review it, approve its application in this jurisdiction. His mouth tightened slightly. But Hammond's right about one thing: men with money and influence generally get their way given time. The frank assessment, while discouraging, held no surprise for Rebecca. She had lived too long in the shadow of the Richardson family's power to harbor illusions about the limits of justice when wealth stood opposed. Then I need to keep moving, she said, decision crystallizing as she spoke, before he secures local approval. Nathan glanced at her, taking in her determined expression, and the protective hand that had unconsciously moved to her belly. "When's the child due?" Rebecca blinked momentarily, thrown by the shift in topic. 2 months, perhaps less. Nathan nodded, as if confirming a private calculation. "Traveling alone in your condition with Hammond looking for you—" He left the sentence unfinished, the risks self-evident. "I don't have much choice," Rebecca replied, a hint of defensive edge entering her voice. "I won't let them take my child." "Didn't say you should." Nathan's tone remained neutral, neither arguing nor agreeing, just noting facts that need considering. They rode in silence for several minutes, each absorbed in private thoughts. The ranch grew larger as they approached its adobe walls, glowing warmly in the midday sun. Despite having spent only a single night there, Rebecca felt a twinge of regret at the prospect of leaving its relative safety. As they neared the barn, Nathan spoke again, his voice carrying the careful neutrality she had come to associate with him weighing difficult matters. "I have a proposal," he said, "if you're willing to hear it." Rebecca tensed slightly, wariness resurfacing. In her experience, proposals from men rarely favored her interests above their own. Yet Nathan had thus far proven himself different from others she had known. Different enough, perhaps, to merit the courtesy of listening. "I'm willing to hear it," she replied cautiously. Nathan dismounted, then stood beside her mare, offering a supportive arm as she did the same. Once she was safely on the ground, he stepped back, respecting the boundaries she maintained through habit and necessity. "Stay here," he said simply, "at least until the child comes. Hammond won't move against you directly, not with witnesses present. By the time he secures local approval for that court order, you'll have delivered. Then you can decide your next move from a position of greater strength." Rebecca stared at him, searching for hidden motives behind the practical suggestion. "Why would you offer this? You barely know me, and sheltering me puts you at odds with powerful people." A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed Nathan's face. "Been at odds with powerful people most of my life, Mrs. Harper. One more won't make much difference." It wasn't a complete answer, and they both knew it. But it was Rebecca sensed as much as Nathan was prepared to offer at this juncture. "I can pay my way," she said, falling back on the assertion that had become her shield against charity or obligation. "I can cook, clean, tend gardens. I'm not without skills." Nathan nodded, accepting the terms without argument. "Never doubted it." He took the reins of both horses, preparing to lead them into the barn. "Think on it. Decision doesn't need making this minute." As he walked away, Rebecca found herself watching his retreating figure with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. The offer he had extended provided a practical solution to her immediate dilemma, a temporary reprieve from Hammond's pursuit. Yet accepting it meant placing trust in a man she barely knew, binding her fate to his, in ways she couldn't fully predict. Still, Nathan Caldwell had thus far honored every promise, respected every boundary. More than that, he had stood between her and danger, without hesitation, asking nothing in return except the truth she had already offered. Perhaps, Rebecca thought, as she made her way to the tack house, trust could be extended in measured increments, tested and verified before being fully bestowed. Perhaps, in this remote corner of the territory, she might find the space to breathe, to plan, to prepare for whatever battles lay ahead. The decision, as Nathan had said, didn't need making this minute. But as Rebecca entered the small building that had become her temporary haven, she found it had already been made somewhere in the quiet corners of her mind. She would stay, for now, until the child came, or until circumstances forced her hand once more. One step at a time, one day at a time. The afternoon heat settled over the ranch like a physical weight, shimmering in waves above the sun-baked earth. Inside the main house, Nathan moved through familiar routines, his hands occupied with mundane tasks, while his mind circled around the woman in his tack house and the complications her presence brought. He hadn't planned to offer her extended shelter. Had intended, in fact, to help her continue her journey once Hammond's immediate threat was addressed. Yet, when the moment came, the words had emerged with the certainty of decisions long considered, as if some part of him had known from their first encounter that their paths were meant to intersect for more than a passing moment. Nathan paused in his work, gaze drifting toward the locked door that led to Emma's preserved room. What would she have thought of his offer, Emma, with her unwavering compassion and clear moral compass? She would have opened their home without hesitation, he knew. Would have embraced Rebecca's cause as her own, with the fierce determination that had characterized everything she did. But Emma was gone, and Nathan was left to navigate these waters alone, guided only by the principles they had once shared, and the man he was still trying to become in the wake of her loss. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Nathan crossed the room and opened it to find Rebecca standing on his porch, the wooden box from the cemetery held carefully in her hands. "I'd like to accept your offer," she said without preamble, "to stay until the child comes." Nathan nodded, stepping back to allow her entry. "Good. Safer for you both." Rebecca placed the box on the table, her fingers lingering on its worn surface. "I want you to see what's inside," she said, voice steady, despite the vulnerability inherent in the gesture. "So you understand exactly what you're involving yourself in by sheltering me." Nathan recognized the significance of the moment trust offered as both gift and warning. He moved to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough to view the contents as she opened the box. Inside lay several bundles of letters and documents, neatly arranged and tied with string. Rebecca selected one and unfolded it, revealing a man's precise handwriting, covering both sides of the page. "Letters from Thomas to his mistress in San Francisco," she explained, handing it to Nathan. "Read the section I've marked." Nathan took the letter, his expression unchanging as he read the passage indicated by a small pencil mark in the margin. "My dear Isabel, arrangements proceed as planned. Once the Denver transaction is complete, I will have secured sufficient independent resources to extricate myself from both family obligations and my increasingly tedious marriage. Father remains oblivious to my activities, believing me fully devoted to expanding the family's legitimate enterprises. The old fool's blindness serves our purposes well. My wife suspects nothing occupied as she is with domestic trivialities and her pathetic attempts to secure my affection. Her condition ensures she remains dependent upon my goodwill, a circumstance I have cultivated with care. When the time comes to depart, she will be left with nothing, save the child she so desperately wanted, a hollow victory that will sustain me during any moments of residual guilt. Soon, my love, we shall begin our life together, unburdened by the constraints that have separated us these many months." Nathan returned the letter to Rebecca, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he processed its contents. "He intended to abandon you." He said the statement flat and uninfected. "Yes." Rebecca refolded the letter with careful precision. "After using me to produce an heir that would satisfy his parents while he conducted his affairs elsewhere." Her voice remained steady, though a slight tremor in her hands betrayed the emotional toll of revisiting these painful truths. "I found these after his death, hidden in a compartment of his traveling case." She selected another document from the box, this one bearing an official seal. "This is perhaps more dangerous. Records of bribes Thomas paid to territorial officials to secure mining rights on land illegally seized from Apache tribes. The Richardsons' fortune is built on such transactions documented here in Thomas's own hand, with dates, amounts, and recipients clearly identified. Nathan studied the document, recognizing names of prominent officials throughout the territory. "This would destroy them," he said quietly, "if made public." "Yes." Rebecca returned the paper to the box and closed the lid. "Now you understand why they're so determined to find me. It's not just the child they want, though that remains their primary concern. It's these documents and the threat they represent to the Richardson Empire." Nathan's eyes met hers, gray and steady, in the afternoon light. "You could have used these, bargained for your freedom." "I considered it," Rebecca admitted. "But Thomas had already taught me the danger of trusting the Richardsons' promises. They would agree to any terms, then eliminate the threat once I was back within their reach." She shook her head slightly. "No, these are insurance of last resort. Protection only if all else fails." The assessment was coldly practical, devoid of the moral hesitation that might have troubled someone less acquainted with survival's harsh necessities. Nathan found himself respecting both her clarity and her restraint. She had the means to destroy her enemies, yet held back from unleashing a power that once released could not be recalled. "The box stays with you," he said after a moment. "Safer that way." Rebecca nodded, reclaiming the container and its dangerous contents. "Thank you for understanding." Nathan moved toward the stove where a pot of coffee simmered. "Hungry?" he asked, changing the subject with characteristic abruptness. The corner of Rebecca's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of the shift in focus. "Yes, actually. I find myself hungry quite often these days." Nathan poured 2 cups of coffee, then began gathering ingredients for a simple meal. Rebecca watched him for a moment before moving to assist, her hands automatically reaching for tasks that needed doing. They worked together in companionable silence, establishing a rhythm that required no discussion or negotiation. It was only after they had eaten, as the light outside began to soften toward evening, that Rebecca broached the subject they had thus far avoided. "The cemetery," she said, cradling her coffee cup between both hands. "The unmarked grave beside Emma's. Who is it?" Nathan stilled his body, tensing almost imperceptibly before he deliberately relaxed each muscle. "My sister," he answered, voice dropping to a lower register. "Charlotte." Rebecca waited, sensing there was more to the story, but unwilling to press where she had no right. After a long moment, Nathan continued, each word measured, as if extracted at significant cost. "She was 19, fell in love with a man our parents didn't approve of, got pregnant." His eyes fixed on some distant point, seeing not the room around them, but scenes from a past that still haunted him. "They sent her away to a cousin's farm in Illinois. Said it was to protect her reputation, but really, it was to hide their shame." Rebecca's hand moved unconsciously to her own belly, feeling a kinship with this unknown woman separated from her by years and circumstance. "I was away." Nathan continued, the words coming more freely now, as if a dam had cracked and could no longer hold back the flood. "With the Union Army serving as a field surgeon. Didn't know about Charlotte's situation until I received a letter from our cousin saying she was ill, the pregnancy complicated." He drew a deep breath, steadying himself against memories that had lost none of their power to wound. "I requested leave, but it was denied. We were in the middle of a campaign, casualties overwhelming what medical staff remained. By the time I could get away, she was gone. Her and the baby both." The stark simplicity of the statement conveyed more than elaborate description ever could: the finality of loss, the helplessness of arriving too late, the guilt that lingered long after rational thought acknowledged no blame could be assigned. "I brought her home," Nathan said after a pause. "Buried her here when Emma and I came west after the war. Couldn't bear to leave her in that place among strangers who had offered too little too late. Rebecca sat very still, absorbing the weight of confidence shared. In her experience, men rarely spoke of grief or regret with such unvarnished honesty. That Nathan had chosen to do so with her, a near stranger, still represented a trust she hadn't expected and wasn't certain she deserved. "I'm sorry," she said, simply, the words inadequate but sincere. Nathan nodded once, accepting both the sentiment and its limitations. It was a long time ago, but they both knew some wounds never fully healed, regardless of time's passage. Some absences remained eternally present, shaping lives long after the initial loss had occurred. Rebecca hesitated, then offered a piece of her own truth in exchange for what Nathan had shared. "The child," she said softly, one hand still resting on her belly. "It isn't Thomas's." Nathan's eyes met hers, neither judging nor surprised. "Figured as much from what you said yesterday." "His name was Michael." Rebecca continued, the name unfamiliar on her tongue after months of careful silence. "He worked for the stage company in San Francisco, a driver on the coastal route. We met when I traveled north to visit my aunt before I knew Thomas or the Richardsons." The memory brought a softness to her face that transformed her features briefly, revealing the woman she might have been without hardship's shaping influence. "He was kind," she said simply, "gentle in ways I hadn't known men could be. We planned to marry when he'd saved enough for a small homestead in Oregon." Her expression clouded. "Then my aunt died, leaving me without means or protection. Thomas Richardson began calling at the boarding house where I stayed, offering security, respectability, a future free from want." Her hand moved in a restless pattern across her belly, as if soothing the child within. "I refused him initially, told him about Michael, about our plans, but Thomas was persistent, and my funds were dwindling. When Michael's stage was robbed and he was killed defending the passengers, I had nowhere to turn." Nathan listened without interruption, allowing her story to unfold at its own pace. "Thomas seemed a salvation then," Rebecca continued, voice hardening with remembered disillusionment. "Charming, generous, from a good family. By the time I discovered his true nature, we were already married and I was convenient, a presentable wife to satisfy his parents while he pursued his own interests elsewhere." She met Nathan's gaze directly, chin lifting in the gesture of defiance he had come to associate with her. "I discovered I was carrying Michael's child 3 weeks after the wedding. Thomas never knew, believed the child was his, conceived on our wedding night." A pause, then quieter. "It was the one secret I managed to keep from him." The admission hung in the air between them, a truth finally spoken after months of careful guardianship. Rebecca waited for Nathan's reaction, for judgment or censure, or worst of all, the calculating reevaluation she had seen in men's eyes when they discovered she was not as respectable as she appeared. Instead, Nathan nodded once, accepting the information with the same equanimity he had shown toward her other revelations. "The child is yours," he said simply. "That's what matters." The statement, direct and unambiguous, struck Rebecca with unexpected force. Not because it was profound or particularly insightful, but because it acknowledged the essential truth she had been fighting to protect, that this child, regardless of its paternity or the circumstances of its conception, belonged to her alone. Not to Thomas, not to the Richardsons, not to society's judgment of women who failed to follow prescribed paths. "Yes," she agreed softly, "that's what matters." Outside, the last light faded from the western sky, leaving the world in darkness pierced only by stars and the soft glow of the lamp on the table between them. In that muted light, Rebecca thought she saw something shift in Nathan's expression. A subtle softening, perhaps, or the recognition of a kindred spirit in the art of carrying wounds without surrendering to them. Whatever it was, passed quickly replaced by his customary reserve as he rose to clear their dishes. Rebecca stood to help their movements again, falling into the unspoken choreography of shared tasks. As they worked, Rebecca found herself studying Nathan's profile, seeking clues to the man beneath the careful restraint. She knew more about him now, about Charlotte, about his service as a surgeon, about the guilt he carried for arriving too late to save his sister. Yet she sensed there were deeper layers, still secrets he guarded as carefully as she had guarded her own. One in particular nagged at her thoughts, the locked room she had glimpsed during her first visit to the house. Nathan had mentioned Emma, his fiancée, who had died of pneumonia, but had offered no further details. The preserved room suggested a grief that remained unresolved, a wound still raw despite the passage of years. Rebecca considered asking directly, then reconsidered. They had shared enough truths for one evening. Some revelations required time and the gradual building of trust to emerge naturally. As if sensing the direction of her thoughts, Nathan spoke without turning from the dish he was drying. "You can ask," he said quietly, "about Emma." Rebecca paused in her work, surprised by his perception. "I didn't want to pry." "Not prying if I offer." Nathan set the dish aside and faced her, his expression carefully neutral. "Emma Sutton. We grew up together in Pennsylvania. Got engaged before I joined the Union Army as a surgeon." He hesitated, then continued with the same measured cadence. "She waited for me. 4 years of war. Wrote every week, even when my replies came months apart, or not at all." Rebecca remained still, sensing that movement might interrupt the flow of memory, now finding voice. "When I came home, I wasn't the same man who'd left," Nathan said, the understatement containing volumes unspoken. "Seen too much, done too much. Hands that had saved when they could, but mostly just managed what couldn't be saved." His gaze dropped briefly to those hands, as if seeing them stained with blood, long since washed away. "Emma didn't care. Said we'd build something new together, somewhere the war hadn't touched. Chose Arizona territory because neither of us had history here." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She had plans. A medical practice for me. Children. A community to serve." Rebecca could picture it, the young couple with their dreams of a fresh start of healing and building in a land unmarked by conflict's scars. "What happened?" she asked softly. Nathan's expression shuddered slightly, though he continued without hesitation. "I was called away. Rancher, 20 miles north, son, trampled by a horse. Critical injuries needed immediate attention." His jaw tightened. "Emma had been coughing for days, said it was nothing, just dust from the dry season. I believed her, left her to tend the boy." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, already anticipating the devastating conclusion. "3 days it took," Nathan said, voice dropping lower. "Working to save that boy. By the time I got home, Emma was burning with fever, fighting for every breath. Pneumonia advanced beyond anything I could treat here." His hands clenched briefly at his sides. "I tried to get her to town, to the doctor there, with better supplies, better conditions. She died on the journey. In my arms, medical bag right beside me, training and experience all around me, and I couldn't save her." The raw pain in his voice belied the 4 years that had passed since that day. Not a wound scabbed over with time's passage, but one that remained fresh, reopened with each remembrance. "It wasn't your fault," Rebecca said gently, knowing even as she spoke that the words, however true, could offer little comfort against such deeply entrenched guilt. "Wasn't it?" Nathan's gaze met hers, storm-gray eyes reflecting both grief and a desperate need for absolution he would not directly request. "I was a doctor, trained to recognize symptoms, to prioritize cases, to make decisions that determined who lived and who died. I missed what was happening right in front of me because I was focused elsewhere. Rebecca considered her response carefully, aware that platitudes would not serve in the face of such honest self-recrimination. "Could the town doctor have saved her?" she asked finally. "If you had recognized the symptoms earlier." Nathan's shoulders slumped slightly, the question striking at the heart of his guilt. "Maybe. Probably not. The fever was high, the infection aggressive. But I should have tried. Should have been there at least." "Instead of saving the boy," Rebecca concluded softly. "Yes." The admission seemed to cost him something significant, as if speaking it aloud reinforced his culpability. Rebecca moved closer, not touching him, but reducing the physical distance between them in a gesture of solidarity. "And if you had stayed with Emma, letting the boy die without attempting to save him, would you find that easier to live with?" Nathan stared at her, momentarily speechless, as the question penetrated layers of guilt and grief to illuminate the impossible choice he had faced. After a long moment, he shook his head once, a barely perceptible movement. "No," he acknowledged quietly. "That would be a different kind of failure." Rebecca nodded, understanding all too well the burden of choices made with incomplete information, judged in hindsight with merciless clarity. "So you carry this one," she said simply, "because it's the one you can bear, even though it breaks you a little more each day." The insight offered without judgment or attempted remedy seemed to reach Nathan in a way that conventional comfort could not. He stood very still, absorbing her words, and the understanding behind them, the recognition that some wounds were not meant to heal completely, but to be carried as testament to loves lost and lessons learned at unbearable cost. "Yes," he said finally, the single syllable containing volumes of acknowledgement. "That's what I do." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way few interactions between them had been. Rebecca felt something shift in that moment. Not a dramatic transformation, but a subtle realignment, as if pieces long separated had moved fractionally closer to forming a complete picture. Outside, the wind picked up, sending a whisper of sound through the eaves of the house. The lamp on the table flickered briefly, casting shifting shadows across Nathan's face, as he visibly gathered himself, retreating from the vulnerability of the moment. "It's late," he said, practical once more. "You should rest." Rebecca recognized the withdrawal, respected it without taking offense. They had shared more in one evening than many did in years of acquaintance. Some retreat was natural, even necessary to process what had been revealed. "Yes," she agreed, moving toward the door. "Thank you for the meal and for telling me about Emma." Nathan nodded once, acknowledging both the spoken gratitude and the unspoken understanding beneath it. "Good night, Mrs. Harper." "Rebecca," she corrected gently. "After everything we've shared, I think we've moved beyond formalities." A hint of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps approval, flickered in Nathan's eyes. "Rebecca, then," he conceded. "Good night." "Good night, Nathan." As she walked back to the tack house under a canopy of stars, Rebecca found herself replaying their conversation, examining the truths shared and the connections formed in their exchange. Nathan Caldwell remained in many ways a mystery, reserved, guarded, carrying burdens he had shouldered alone for years. Yet she felt she understood him better now, recognized in him a kindred spirit navigating loss and regret, without surrendering to either. Inside her temporary home, Rebecca prepared for sleep with the careful movements of a woman accustomed to self-reliance. As she lay in the darkness, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, where her child grew, she found herself considering the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this place, to this man with his own scars and secrets. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, Rebecca felt something unfamiliar stirring within her. Not quite hope, not yet, but its quieter precursor. A sense that perhaps she was not entirely alone in her struggle, that perhaps there existed in this harsh landscape a space where healing might eventually begin. It was a dangerous feeling, one that had led to disappointment and betrayal in the past. Yet, as sleep claimed her, Rebecca allowed it to remain a small flame, carefully tended against the darkness that had for so long been her constant companion. The days that followed established a rhythm neither Rebecca nor Nathan had consciously designed, but which emerged naturally from their separate routines and shared spaces. Rebecca rose early, tending the chickens and gathering eggs before the heat of the day set in. Nathan saw to the horses and necessary ranch work, returning at midday for a simple meal they often prepared together in companionable silence. Afternoons found Rebecca working in the garden or mending clothes, while Nathan repaired equipment or tended to correspondence in the shade of the porch. Evenings they shared dinner, sometimes talking, sometimes not, depending on the day's events and their respective moods. It was a pattern born of practicality rather than intimacy, yet containing elements of both the automatic consideration of another's needs, the gradual alignment of habits to accommodate shared space, the unspoken recognition of boundaries to be respected. A week passed with no sign of Hammond or his associates, then another. Rebecca began to hope cautiously that perhaps the attorney had abandoned his pursuit, recognizing the challenges of enforcing his court order in this remote jurisdiction. Nathan remained less optimistic, checking regularly with contacts in town for any news of legal filings or inquiries about Rebecca's whereabouts. "Hammond's not the type to give up easily," he warned one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "More likely, he's regrouping, gathering resources for a more formal approach." Rebecca nodded, accepting the assessment without argument. She had learned through bitter experience the persistence of men who viewed themselves as rightfully entitled to what they sought. "Then we should prepare," she said simply, "for when he returns." Nathan glanced at her, noting the determined set of her jaw and the protective hand that had become a habitual presence over her growing belly. "Yes," he agreed. "We should." The preparations they undertook over the following days were practical and thorough. Nathan showed Rebecca the hidden paths that led away from the ranch, the caves in the nearby hills where one might shelter temporarily if needed. He taught her to use the rifle he kept for protection against predators, both animal and human. She practiced until her arms ached, determined to master this skill she had never before required. For her part, Rebecca organized the evidence against the Richardsons, creating duplicate copies of the most damning documents and concealing them in separate locations. Insurance, she called it. Still, though both recognized it as the weapon of last resort, it truly was. They spoke little of their shared histories during these preparations, focusing instead on immediate concerns and practical solutions. Yet the knowledge they had exchanged that night remained between them, a foundation upon which something new was gradually, tentatively, being built. Not friendship, exactly the term seemed inadequate for the complex understanding they had reached. Not romance, certainly both carried too many wounds, too many responsibilities to consider such entanglements. But something that contained elements of both, a connection forged through mutual recognition of pain endured and strength maintained despite it. It was during this period of watchful waiting that Rebecca made a discovery, one that shifted her understanding of Nathan Caldwell yet again. She had been searching the storage shed for canning jars, preparing to preserve some of the garden's late summer bounty. In a dusty corner behind stacked crates of equipment, she found a battered wooden case, its brass hinges tarnished with age and disuse. Curiosity drew her to examine it more closely. The case was locked, but the key lay nearby, as if someone had intended to open it and been interrupted. Rebecca hesitated, aware that she was trespassing on Nathan's privacy. Yet something about the case, its careful placement, hidden yet accessible, suggested importance beyond ordinary storage. With a silent apology for the intrusion, she inserted the key and opened the lid. Inside lay a musical instrument, a diatonic button accordion, its pearl inlays and ornate scrollwork, speaking of craftsmanship and care despite years of evident use. Beside it rested several handwritten sheets of music, the notes faded but still legible on yellowing paper. Rebecca lifted the accordion, carefully struck by the unexpected discovery. In all their conversations, Nathan had never mentioned musical ability or interest. Yet here was evidence of not just casual playing, but dedicated practice and original composition. The sound of footsteps outside the shed made her start guiltily. Rebecca hastily replaced the accordion and closed the case, turning to find Nathan standing in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, gesturing toward the case. "I was looking for canning jars and found I shouldn't have opened it." Nathan's gaze moved from her face to the case and back again, his expression softening slightly. "Emma's," he said after a moment. "She played, tried to teach me, but I never had the patience to learn properly." Rebecca nodded, relieved he wasn't angry at her intrusion, but still uncomfortable with having stumbled upon something so personal. "It's beautiful," she offered. "The craftsmanship, I mean." "Her father made it for her 16th birthday," Nathan explained, moving into the shed to stand beside the case. "Carved the decorations himself, ordered the mechanical parts from Philadelphia." His hand rested briefly on the lid, a gesture almost like a caress. "She played every evening after dinner. Said music was medicine for the soul, as necessary as the medicine I provided for the body." The image formed easily in Rebecca's mind. Emma at the end of a long day, filling their home with melodies while Nathan listened, perhaps smiling in a way he rarely did now. Another piece of the man he had been before loss had reshaped him, glimpsed through the artifact of a life interrupted. "You keep it here instead of in the house," she observed quietly, understanding dawning, "where you can visit it, but not see it every day." Nathan's eyes met hers, recognition of her insight evident in his gaze. "Yes," he acknowledged simply. "Some reminders are easier to manage in measured doses." And Rebecca nodded, thinking of Michael's harmonica tucked carefully in her bundle, taken out only when solitude and darkness provided sufficient privacy for grief. "I understand," she said softly. For a moment, they stood in silence, connected by this shared experience of preserving memory, while protecting oneself from its overwhelming power. Then Nathan seemed to gather himself, returning to the practical concerns that structured his days. "Found the jars?" he said, reaching past her to indicate a crate near where the accordion had been stored. "Need help carrying them back?" Rebecca shook her head, grateful for the return to ordinary matters. "I can manage. Thank you." As Nathan turned to leave, however, she found herself speaking again, compelled by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "I play too," she said. "The harmonica. Not well, but it helps sometimes to have music when words aren't enough." Nathan paused in his doorway, glancing back at her with an expression that contained both surprise and something softer, more vulnerable. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "It does." With that, he was gone, leaving Rebecca to gather the canning jars and her thoughts, both suddenly requiring more careful handling than she had anticipated. That evening, as darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the velvet sky, Rebecca sat on the bench outside the tack house, harmonica in hand. The melody she played was one her father had taught her long ago, a simple folk tune that spoke of homecoming and welcome of hearths kept warm against winter's approach. From the main house came the soft notes of an accordion, hesitant at first, then gaining confidence as it picked up the harmony of her melody. The two instruments wove together in the night air, creating something neither could have produced alone. A conversation without words, a connection forged through music, when speech would have been inadequate. Rebecca closed her eyes, allowing the unexpected duet to wash over her. In this moment, with stars above and music surrounding her, the fear that had been her constant companion for months receded slightly, replaced by something she had almost forgotten how to recognize: peace. Fragile and temporary, perhaps, but real nonetheless. As the final notes faded into silence, Rebecca opened her eyes to find Nathan standing at the edge of his porch, accordion held carefully in hands more accustomed to tools than instruments. Their gazes met across the yard, acknowledging without words the bridge they had just created between their separate solitudes. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The music had said what words could not, that even in the midst of loss and danger, beauty remained possible, that connections could form in unexpected places between souls carrying similar wounds, that perhaps in this harsh landscape where little flourished without careful tending, something new might yet take root and grow. The weeks passed with deceptive tranquility. September yielded to October, bringing cooler mornings and evenings, though the days remained warm. The garden provided a steady harvest, which Rebecca preserved with practiced hands. Nathan tended to ranch duties, repaired fences damaged by summer storms, and made preparations for the coming winter. To an outside observer, they might have appeared a long-established couple moving through daily routines with the ease of shared experience. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, both remained vigilant, aware that the respite from Hammond's pursuit could not last indefinitely. Rebecca's condition advanced visibly with each passing day. The child grew active, particularly in the evenings, its movements sometimes visible through the fabric of her dress, as she sat on the porch mending or shelling peas. Nathan observed these changes with quiet attention, noting when tasks became more difficult for her, stepping in without comment to handle the heavier work she had previously managed. "I'm not an invalid," Rebecca protested one afternoon when he took a basket of wet laundry from her hands before she could hang it. "Never said you were," Nathan replied with his characteristic economy of words. "Just figured 4 hands work faster than 2. The simple practicality of his explanation, devoid of condescension or overprotectiveness, disarmed her objections. They worked together to hang the laundry, the task indeed completed more quickly, with shared effort. Such moments punctuated their days, small accommodations, practical solutions, the gradual alignment of two independent lives into a pattern that supported both without diminishing either. Not the passionate bond of romantic attachment, but something perhaps more durable: mutual respect, shared purpose, and the quiet comfort of knowing another person saw you clearly, without illusion or expectation. In the evenings they often sat on Nathan's porch, watching as darkness claimed the land and stars emerged in the vast desert sky. Sometimes they talked careful conversations that revealed more of their separate histories without venturing into territories too painful to explore. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence. Rebecca working on baby clothes, fashioned from fabric Nathan had purchased in town. Nathan carving small wooden figures that accumulated on the porch rail. Occasionally, when the night felt particularly still, music would bridge the silence between them. Rebecca's harmonica answering Nathan's hesitant accordion, their separate melodies weaving together in harmonies neither had planned, but which emerged naturally like water finding its path downhill. It was during one such evening, with the moon rising full and golden over the eastern ridge, that Rebecca felt the first unfamiliar tightening across her abdomen, different from the practice contractions she had experienced intermittently for weeks. She paused in her sewing, one hand moving to press against the spot where the sensation had been strongest. Nathan, ever observant, noted the interruption in her rhythm. "Everything all right?" Rebecca nodded, resuming her work with deliberate calm. "Just the baby stretching. It happens." Nathan studied her for a moment, gray eyes, assessing in the lamplight, but didn't press further. He returned to the small wooden horse taking shape beneath his knife, seemingly content to accept her explanation. When the tightening came again 20 minutes later, more pronounced than before, Rebecca managed to keep her expression neutral, despite the momentary discomfort. Too early, she told herself. The child wasn't due for several weeks yet. These were simply more practice contractions preparing her body for what was to come. Yet, as the evening progressed, the sensations returned with increasing frequency and intensity. By the time they had finished their customary cup of tea before retiring, Rebecca could no longer dismiss them as routine discomfort. This was the beginning of labor, a process she had witnessed in others but never experienced herself. She should tell Nathan she knew. Yet something held her back. Not fear of his reaction, but a deeper hesitation born of long habit. Throughout her life, Rebecca had faced challenges, alone, had learned to rely on her own resources rather than risk dependence on others who might withdraw support when most needed. "Good night," she said, instead rising from her chair with careful movements that betrayed nothing of the tightening pressure across her midsection. "Thank you for the tea." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful as he watched her gather her sewing. "Weather's changing," he observed, glancing toward the western horizon where clouds had begun to gather. "Might rain by morning." "Yes," Rebecca agreed, grateful for the mundane topic. "The garden could use it." They parted with the same quiet civility that characterized all their interactions, Nathan remaining on the porch with his carving. Rebecca walking carefully back to the tack house, one hand pressed to her lower back, where an ache had begun to settle. Inside her small sanctuary, Rebecca moved methodically through preparations she had planned for weeks. Fresh linens laid out, clean cloths stacked nearby, water heating on the small stove. Each task completed between waves of tightening that grew steadily more insistent. This child would enter the world here in this place, where she had found unexpected refuge. Rebecca had decided this after careful consideration, weighing risks against alternatives. The nearest town was 3 hours' ride, its doctor of questionable competence and unknown loyalty. Senora Alvarez, the local midwife Nathan had mentioned, lived nearly as far in the opposite direction, her services primarily devoted to the Mexican families scattered throughout the valley. No better to handle this herself, as she had handled every other challenge life had presented. She had assisted at enough births during her time with Aunt Margaret to understand the process, had prepared herself mentally and physically for what was to come. What she hadn't prepared for was the intensity. As midnight approached and the contractions strengthened, Rebecca found herself gripping the edge of the small table, breathing through pain that surpassed anything in her previous experience. Between waves, she moved around the small space, instinctively seeking positions that might ease the growing pressure. Outside, the wind had risen, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low counterpoint to Rebecca's carefully controlled breathing. The storm's arrival seemed fitting nature's drama, unfolding in parallel with her own internal tempest. When her water broke shortly after midnight, soaking her skirt and the rug beneath her feet, Rebecca acknowledged what she had been resisting for hours. This birth would not be the straightforward process she had envisioned. The child was coming weeks early, the contractions already stronger and closer together than she had anticipated at this stage. She needed help. The admission cost her something significant, a surrender of independence she had guarded fiercely throughout her life. Yet, as another contraction gripped her stealing breath and rational thought for its duration, Rebecca recognized the dangerous pride in continued self-reliance. This wasn't just about her anymore. The child deserved every chance, every advantage she could provide, including the assistance of someone with more experience than she possessed. When the contraction eased, Rebecca's straightened decision made. She would go to Nathan, would ask for his help, or at least for him to fetch Señora Alvarez, if time permitted. The first drops of rain began to fall as she opened the tack house door, fat droplets that left dark spots on the dusty ground. Rebecca pulled a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside immediately, drenched by the sudden downpour that accompanied a brilliant flash of lightning. The main house stood dark, no light visible from its windows. Nathan must have retired while she battled privately with her labor and pride. Rebecca started toward it anyway, moving as quickly as her condition allowed, one arm wrapped protectively around her belly. She was halfway across the yard when another contraction seized her stronger than any before. Rebecca gasped, knees buckling, as pain radiated from her back around to her abdomen. She sank to the ground, rain soaking through her clothes as she fought to breathe through the overwhelming sensation. "Rebecca!" Nathan's voice cut through the storm's rumble close enough that she looked up in surprise. He stood a few feet away, coat hastily thrown over nightclothes, hair plastered to his forehead by rain. "The baby," she managed as the contraction eased slightly. "It's coming! Now!" Nathan was beside her instantly, one arm around her waist, supporting her weight as she struggled to stand. "How long?" he asked, already guiding her toward the main house. "Hours," Rebecca admitted, leaning into his strength as another wave of pain began building. "Thought I could handle it myself." A brief flash of something exasperation, perhaps, crossed Nathan's face, quickly replaced by focused determination. "Let's get you inside." The few steps to the house stretched into an eternity as Rebecca fought through another contraction. By the time they reached the porch, she was trembling as much from tension as from the cold rain that had soaked her to the skin. Nathan opened the door, still supporting most of her weight. "The bedroom," he said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "It's ready." Rebecca glanced at him sharply despite her discomfort. "Ready. Been ready for weeks," Nathan replied simply. "Just in case." The quiet admission that he had prepared for this possibility while allowing her the illusion of independent choice might have sparked resentment under other circumstances. Now it brought only relief and a curious warmth that had nothing to do with physical comfort. The bedroom Nathan led her to was small but clean, dominated by a narrow bed covered with fresh linens. A fire burned low in a small grate, taking the chill from the air. On a table nearby lay an array of cloths, a basin of water, and several instruments that Rebecca recognized from her own preparations. "You thought of everything," she murmured as Nathan helped her to the bed. "Not everything," he acknowledged, his calm demeanor belied by the tension visible in his shoulders. "But enough to start. Señora Alvarez taught me the basics after Emma." He trailed off, then continued with renewed focus. "We should get you into dry clothes." Rebecca nodded, another contraction building before she could speak. She gripped Nathan's hand, without thinking the need for support, overriding any considerations of propriety or independence. To her surprise, he didn't pull away or stiffen at the contact. Instead, his fingers curled around hers, steady and warm, offering an anchor against the tide of sensation threatening to overwhelm her. "Breathe," he instructed quietly. "Slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth." Rebecca followed his guidance, finding unexpected relief in the rhythmic breathing pattern. When the contraction passed, she released his hand, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the gesture. "I'll step out," Nathan said, moving toward a chest of drawers. "There's a nightgown here, Emma's, but it should serve. Can you manage, or do you need help?" The practical question, asked without embarrassment or hesitation, somehow made the situation less awkward than Rebecca had feared. "I can manage," she assured him. "But don't go far. They're coming faster now." Nathan nodded, handing her the simple white nightgown before stepping outside, pulling the door nearly closed behind him. "Call when you're ready," he said. "Or if another one starts before then." Left alone, Rebecca changed as quickly as her awkward movements allowed, grateful for the dry garment despite its poignant origin. Emma's nightgown preserved like everything else that had belonged to her. The fact that Nathan had offered it for Rebecca's use represented a trust she hadn't expected and wasn't certain she deserved. She had barely finished when another contraction began, this one accompanied by an overwhelming urge to push. "Nathan," she called, abandoning pride in the face of physiological imperative. "It's time." He re-entered immediately, assessing the situation with a glance. Without wasted motion, he helped Rebecca position herself on the bed, placing pillows behind her back for support. His movements were efficient, almost clinical, yet underpinned by a gentleness that belied his usual reserve. "I need to check your progress," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "If that's all right." Rebecca nodded beyond embarrassment or hesitation. This was no longer about personal boundaries or propriety. It was about bringing her child safely into the world with whatever assistance proved necessary. Nathan's examination was brief and professional, his expression revealing nothing beyond focused attention. "The baby's coming fast," he confirmed, washing his hands in the basin beside the bed. "Probably because it's early. Your body's doing what it needs to do." The calm assessment, delivered without alarm or uncertainty, steadied Rebecca's nerves. "Have you done this before?" she asked between controlled breaths as another contraction built. "Twice," Nathan replied, arranging clean cloths within reach. "Once during the war, once with Senora Alvarez after Emma died." A shadow crossed his face there and gone in an instant. "Been present for more, but not as the primary attendant." Under normal circumstances, this limited experience might have concerned Rebecca. Now it seemed almost reassuring Nathan had faced this situation before, had presumably managed successfully, since he mentioned it without evident distress. "I trust you," she said simply, then gasped as the contraction peaked, bringing with it an irresistible pressure. "I need to push." "Then push," Nathan instructed, positioning himself at the foot of the bed. "Your body knows what to do. I'm just here to help if needed." What followed was a blur of sensation and effort, time measured not in minutes, but in the rhythm of contractions, the brief respites between, and the steady encouragement of Nathan's voice, guiding her through each wave. Outside, the storm continued, rain lashing against the windows, and thunder shaking the small house, nature's percussion accompanying the ancient drama unfolding within. Through it all, Nathan remained a steady presence, wiping her forehead when sweat threatened to blind her, supporting her back when she needed to change positions, offering water during the brief moments between contractions. His calm never wavered his focus, never shifted his hands, never trembled, despite the responsibility he had assumed without hesitation. "The head's crowning," he announced, after what might have been minutes or hours. "One more push should do it." Rebecca gathered her remaining strength, bearing down with a determination born of both desperation and hope. The sensation of stretching, burning, then sudden release, as the baby's head emerged, fully brought a cry to her lips, part pain, part triumph. "That's it," Nathan encouraged, his voice containing more warmth than she had ever heard from him. "Just the shoulders now. One more. With a final effort that seemed to consume every ounce of strength remaining in her body, Rebecca pushed. The feeling of the child sliding from her body into Nathan's waiting hands was unlike anything she had experienced, emptying and fulfilling simultaneously, an ending and beginning contained in a single moment. For one heartbeat, silence filled the room, broken only by Rebecca's ragged breathing and the storm's continued rage outside. Then a thin cry rose above, both indignant, insistent, unmistakably alive. "A boy," Nathan said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite conceal. "Small but strong." He placed the infant on Rebecca's chest, covering both with a warm blanket. The child's skin was still slick with birth, his face wrinkled and red from the journey, dark hair plastered to his tiny skull. Yet when he blinked up at Rebecca, his eyes held a solemn intensity that seemed at odds with his newborn state. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears blurring her vision as she counted fingers and toes, confirming with her own eyes what her heart already knew. This child, this miracle had arrived safely, despite every obstacle placed in his path. "You're finally here." The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a recognition, perhaps his tiny hand flexing against her skin. Rebecca looked up to find Nathan watching them, an expression on his face she had never seen before. Something raw and vulnerable quickly masked as he noticed her attention. "He seems healthy," Nathan said, returning to practical matters as he prepared to deliver the afterbirth. "Good color, strong cry. Small, but that's expected for early arrival." Rebecca nodded, unable to take her eyes from her son's face. "Michael's son," she corrected silently. The child they had created together during those brief, precious weeks before fate had torn them apart. Not a Richardson heir, but a Harper born free from the legacy Thomas had intended to impose. "Joseph," she said, suddenly the name emerging from some deep place within her. "His name is Joseph Michael Harper." Nathan glanced up from his work, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "Good name," he approved quietly. "Strong name." The afterbirth delivered and disposed of. Nathan helped Rebecca clean up and change into fresh linens while she held the now sleeping infant. His movements remained efficient but gentle, his manner professional, yet underpinned by something deeper, a respect that transcended conventional boundaries, an understanding born of shared vulnerability. When everything was settled, Nathan brought her a cup of broth he must have prepared earlier, the savory warmth exactly what her depleted body craved. "You should rest," he said, straightening the blankets around her and the baby. "Both of you." Rebecca nodded, exhaustion washing over her now that the immediate crisis had passed. Yet as Nathan turned to leave, something made her reach out, catching his hand in a gesture as spontaneous as it was unprecedented. "Stay," she said softly. "Please, just until we fall asleep." Nathan hesitated, surprise evident in his momentarily unguarded expression. Then he nodded once, settling into the chair beside the bed, without comment. His hand remained in hers, warm and calloused, a tangible connection in the quiet aftermath of transformation. As Rebecca drifted toward sleep, the baby nestled securely against her chest. She found herself thinking that for all her preparations, all her careful planning, she could never have anticipated this, the sense of safety created not by locks or weapons or escape routes, but by the presence of someone who had proven, when it mattered most, that she was not alone. Outside, the storm gradually abated, rain softening to a gentle patter against the roof. Inside, in the small bedroom warmed by firelight, 3 souls rested, 2 finding sleep. 1 keeping watch, all connected by something that had no name, but felt in that moment like the beginning of healing. The days following Joseph's birth established a new rhythm, different from what had preceded it, yet containing echoes of the same. Rebekah remained in Nathan's house, occupying the bedroom he had prepared while he slept on a pallet in the main room. The arrangement was temporary, they both understood, yet neither mentioned its eventual conclusion. Nathan proved an unexpected ally in these early days of motherhood. He anticipated needs before Rebekah voiced them, appearing with water when she was thirsty, food when she was hungry, an extra blanket when the night turned cool. He held Joseph with surprising confidence, while Rebekah bathed or rested his large hands, cradling the tiny form with a gentleness that made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. "You're good with him," she observed one afternoon watching, as Nathan walked the fussing infant around the room, murmuring words too low for her to catch. Nathan glanced up, a flicker of something pleasure, perhaps crossing his features before disappearing beneath his usual reserve. "Had younger siblings," he replied simply, "and delivered enough babies during the war to learn the basics." It was more personal history than he typically offered without direct questioning. Rebekah stored the information away, another piece in the puzzle of Nathan Caldwell's past. As her strength returned, Rebekah gradually resumed her share of household tasks, Joseph nestled in a sling across her chest, or sleeping in the cradle Nathan had produced from the barn and refinished during her confinement. They fell into a partnership of sorts, dividing responsibilities with the same unspoken coordination that had characterized their interactions before the birth. Through it all, Hammond's absence continued a blessing, Rebekah accepted with cautious gratitude, while remaining vigilant for his inevitable return. The attorney had proven himself both persistent and resourceful. His failure to reappear after their confrontation suggested not surrender, but strategic regrouping. Nathan shared her assessment, maintaining regular contact with allies in town who would warn of any legal filings or inquiries about Rebekah's whereabouts. "He'll come," Nathan said one evening as they sat on the porch, Joseph sleeping peacefully in Rebekah's arms. "Question is, when and with what resources behind him?" Rebekah nodded, her arms tightening instinctively around her son. "The court order," he mentioned. "How long would it take to have it recognized here?" "Depends," Nathan replied, his gaze scanning the darkening horizon with habitual vigilance. "Judge Franklin's protective of his jurisdiction, doesn't appreciate outside interference, but he's also amenable to influence, particularly the financial kind." The frank assessment, while discouraging, held no surprise for Rebekah. She had lived too long in the shadow of wealth's power to harbor illusions about the limits of justice when sufficient money was involved. "Then we should prepare," she said, the same conclusion they had reached weeks earlier, now carrying more urgent significance with Joseph's arrival. "For when he returns." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful as he watched mother and child. "There's another option," he said after a moment. "One we haven't discussed." Rebekah looked up sharply, tension immediately replacing the peaceful lassitude that had settled over her. "What option?" "Marriage." The word hung in the air between them, startling in its directness after weeks of careful conversation. Rebekah stared at Nathan, searching his face for signs of the motivation behind such an unexpected proposal. "A legal marriage would complicate Hammond's claim considerably." Nathan continued, his tone remaining practical, almost detached. "The Richardson family's court order pertains to Rebekah Richardson and her unborn child. Rebekah Caldwell, with an already born son, presents a different legal situation entirely." Rebekah's mind raced, analyzing the suggestion from multiple angles. As a practical strategy, it had merit, creating a legal barrier that would require time and additional resources for Hammond to overcome. Yet the personal implications stretched far beyond tactical advantage. "That's," she began, then paused, uncertain how to respond to a proposal framed entirely in terms of legal strategy rather than emotional connection. Just an option, Nathan finished for her, his expression carefully neutral. Something to consider, not decide now. Rebecca studied him, trying to discern what lay beneath the practical exterior, whether this suggestion stemmed solely from protective instinct or contained elements of genuine desire for a more permanent connection. Nathan's face revealed nothing beyond attentive patience, waiting for her response without evident anxiety or expectation. "I'll think about it," she said finally, the non-committal answer feeling inadequate yet necessary given the complexity of what he had proposed. Nathan nodded once, accepting her response without pressing for greater clarity. "No rush," he assured her, rising from his chair. "Just wanted it on the table alongside other possibilities." As he disappeared into the house, ostensibly to prepare the evening meal, Rebecca remained on the porch, Joseph warm against her chest, as she contemplated the implications of Nathan's suggestion. Marriage. The word itself carried such weight, such history, both personal and societal. Her brief union with Thomas had left scars deeper than she sometimes acknowledged, wounds that still influenced her interactions with men and her expectations of relationships. The idea of entering another marriage, even one with such clearly defined practical purposes, stirred complicated emotions she had believed safely contained. Yet Nathan was nothing like Thomas. Where Thomas had been charming and demonstrative, Nathan was reserved and straightforward. Where Thomas had sought to control through manipulation and isolation, Nathan offered support, without imposition, assistance, without expectation. Where Thomas had viewed her as a possession to be acquired and eventually discarded, Nathan had consistently treated her as an autonomous individual whose choices deserved respect. These differences should have made the decision simpler. Instead, they created new complexities, questions about what such a union might become over time, what expectations might develop despite their practical beginnings, what boundaries might blur between partnership and deeper connection. Joseph stirred against her chest, small fists waving in momentary protest before settling back into sleep. Rebecca looked down at her son, this miracle she had carried and protected through months of uncertainty and fear. Whatever decision she made would affect him as profoundly as it affected her, perhaps more so, given his vulnerability and complete dependence. A marriage of convenience with Nathan would provide Joseph with legal protection, a stable home, a male figure in his life, who had already demonstrated care and commitment. These were not insignificant considerations for a woman alone in a world that often proved hostile to such independence. Yet Rebecca hesitated, unwilling to make such a consequential decision based solely on practical advantages. If she married again, if she bound her life to another's through legal and social covenant, she wanted more than strategic benefit. She wanted truth between them, clear understanding of what each offered, and expected genuine care rather than mere convenience. Nathan had offered marriage as an option, presented with the same calm practicality he brought to discussions of fence repairs or garden planning. Whether deeper feelings influenced his proposal remained unclear, his careful reserve making it impossible to discern emotional motivation beneath strategic reasoning. As twilight deepened around her, Rebecca acknowledged that this decision, unlike so many others she had made in recent months, could not be rushed. For now, she would continue as they had been, partners in protecting Joseph allies against whatever threats Hammond's return might bring, friends building tentative trust across the scars of past wounds. The rest, if it was meant to develop, would reveal itself in time. The knock came at dawn, 3 sharp raps against the front door that cut through the quiet morning like gunshots. Rebecca, already awake with Joseph for his early feeding, felt her body tense instinctively at the sound. No visitor had come to the ranch during her entire stay. Any arrival now, particularly at such an hour, could only mean trouble. Nathan appeared from the main room, hastily dressed, one hand moving automatically to check the rifle kept loaded by the door. His eyes met Rebecca's across the small space, a silent communication passing between them. "Take Joseph to the back bedroom," he said quietly. "Stay there until I call you." Rebecca nodded, gathering her son against her chest, as she moved quickly toward the bedroom furthest from the front door. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of figures on horseback, more than one, though how many she couldn't determine in the dim early light. Hammond had returned, and not alone. Inside the bedroom, Rebecca moved with swift efficiency, pulling on a shawl and shoes, securing Joseph in his sling across her chest. From beneath the mattress, she retrieved the small revolver Nathan had given her weeks ago, checking that it was loaded before tucking it into the pocket of her skirt. Then she positioned herself beside the window, angled to see the yard, without being visible from outside. 4 men had dismounted near the porch. Hammond, in his distinctive bowler hat, Sheriff Taylor from Merrill Creek, and 2 others Rebecca didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested hired muscle rather than legal authority. Nathan stood in the doorway, blocking entry to the house, his posture relaxed yet alert. Rebecca couldn't hear their conversation clearly, only catching fragments carried on the morning breeze. "Legal order signed by Judge Franklin himself. Within my rights to verify. The child is mine by law." Or Joseph stirred against her chest, making small sounds that might soon become cries, if not soothed. Rebecca rocked gently, humming a barely audible melody while straining to hear the exchange on the porch. Nathan's voice carried more clearly, its measured cadence recognizable even at this distance. "Happy to discuss this at a reasonable hour. Wife is resting with our newborn son." Rebecca's breath caught at the deliberate misinformation. "Our son." Nathan was implementing the strategy they had discussed, presenting Joseph as his own child, rather than the Richardson heir Hammond sought. A logical approach, yet, hearing the claim spoken aloud, stirred something unexpected in her chest. Not objection, but a curious warmth she had no time to examine. The conversation outside grew more heated, Hammond's refined tones giving way to sharper, more insistent demands. The sheriff's deeper voice intervened occasionally, not supporting Hammond outright, but clearly unwilling to dismiss his claims entirely. Rebecca strained to hear Nathan's responses, calm and measured, despite the increasing tension evident in the visitor's demeanor. Whatever strategy he employed seemed partially effective. The confrontation continued without escalation to physical threat, the exchange remaining within the bounds of tense negotiation rather than outright hostility. Then a new voice joined the discussion, female authoritative, with a distinctive Spanish accent. Rebecca shifted position slightly, trying to glimpse this unexpected arrival through the window's limited view. Señora Alvarez sat atop a dappled mare at the edge of the yard, her silver-streaked black hair braided and wrapped around her head, her posture regal despite her advanced years. Rebecca had never met the midwife personally, but Nathan had described her often enough that identification was immediate. The midwife's arrival changed the dynamic on the porch visibly. Sheriff Taylor straightened, removing his hat, in a gesture of respect that spoke to Señora Alvarez's standing in the community. Hammond appeared less pleased, his rigid posture suggesting frustration at this new complication. Señora Alvarez dismounted with surprising agility for a woman of her years, approaching the group with unhurried confidence. Whatever she said upon joining the conversation caused Hammond to step back, his face flushing visibly even at this distance. The sheriff nodded several times, his expression shifting from official detachment to something more thoughtful. Rebecca wished desperately that she could hear their words clearly, could understand what argument or evidence Señora Alvarez offered that affected the men so noticeably. But Joseph had begun to fuss in earnest, now tiny fists waving as his face scrunched in preparation for a full-throated cry. "Shh, little one," Rebecca whispered, moving away from the window to bounce him gently in the rhythm that usually soothed his discomfort. "Just a little longer." Whether responding to her voice or the motion, Joseph settled, somewhat his protests reduced to intermittent whimpers. Rebecca returned to her position by the window, careful to remain out of sight while maintaining her view of the confrontation. The scene had shifted again. Hammond appeared to be arguing vehemently with the sheriff, who shook his head repeatedly in response. Senora Alvarez stood beside Nathan, her presence clearly aligned with his position rather than the visitor's. The two hired men exchanged glances that suggested growing uncertainty about the situation's trajectory. After several more minutes of heated discussion, the sheriff made a definitive gesture that seemed to end the debate. Hammond's posture radiated fury and frustration, but he stepped back, returning to his horse with rigid movements that spoke of tightly controlled anger. The sheriff remained on the porch a moment longer, speaking to Nathan with what appeared to be a warning or instruction, before following Hammond to the waiting horses. The four men mounted and rode away, their departure marked by dust clouds rising in the early morning light. Only Senora Alvarez remained, following Nathan into the house after a final survey of the surrounding landscape. Rebecca waited heart-pounding for Nathan's signal that it was safe to emerge. When it came, a soft knock and his voice calling her name, she opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, Senora Alvarez beside him. "They're gone," Nathan said simply. "For now." Rebecca stepped into the hallway, Joseph now fully awake and alert in her arms. "What happened? What did they want?" Nathan glanced at Senora Alvarez, an unspoken communication passing between them. "Hammond brought a court order signed by Judge Franklin," he explained, "authorizing him to take custody of the infant child of Rebecca Richardson pending formal hearings in San Francisco." Rebecca's arms tightened instinctively around Joseph. "But you told them that you are Rebecca Caldwell, my wife." Nathan finished his expression, revealing nothing of how he felt about claiming this falsehood. "And that our son Joseph was born 3 weeks ago under Senora Alvarez's supervision." Rebecca turned to the midwife, questions evident in her expression. The older woman smiled, slightly dark eyes, warm with understanding. "I have delivered many babies in this county." Senora Alvarez said, her accented English precise and clear, "including, as far as anyone need know, your son, Joseph Caldwell, born to you and your husband, Nathan, 3 weeks ago in this house." Understanding dawned. "You testified to this?" To the sheriff, Senora Alvarez nodded, the silver beads woven into her braids catching the morning light. "I keep no written records, only memories. My memory is that I attended the birth of Joseph Caldwell 3 weeks ago. The sheriff respects my word in such matters." The simple statement, delivered without hesitation or qualification, represented a gift Rebecca hadn't anticipated: the protection of community standing placed between her child and those who would claim him. "Why?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. Why would you do this?" Senora Alvarez's expression softened, her gaze moving from Rebecca to Nathan and back again. "I know him," she replied simply. "That is enough." She reached out, weathered fingers brushing Joseph's cheek with gentle benediction. "Besides, the child has your eyes, not those of the Richardson family. Some truths speak for themselves." The observation, casually delivered, yet penetrating in its accuracy, sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. Senora Alvarez saw more than she revealed, understood more than had been explicitly shared. Yet that understanding had been placed in service of protection, rather than exposure, another unexpected ally, in a world that had offered few. "Thank you." Rebecca said the words inadequate for the magnitude of what the midwife had done. Senora Alvarez acknowledged the gratitude with a slight nod. "They will return," she warned practicality, replacing the momentary warmth. The sheriff convinced Hammond that further investigation is needed before action can be taken, but such delay merely postpones confrontation, not prevents it. "How long do we have?" Nathan asked, his mind already turning to preparations, as Rebecca knew his would. "A week, perhaps 2, Senora Alvarez replied. Hammond left for San Francisco this morning, likely to seek additional documentation or witnesses to support his claim. The sheriff promised no action would be taken in his absence. "And when Hammond returns," Rebecca pressed, "will the sheriff support his claim?" Senora Alvarez's expression grew thoughtful. "Sheriff Taylor is not a bad man, but neither is he a brave one. If Hammond returns with convincing evidence and powerful allies, the sheriff will follow the path of least resistance." The assessment, while concerning, contained no surprises. Rebecca had encountered enough men like Sheriff Taylor to recognize the type not actively malicious, but unwilling to stand against power or wealth when doing so might prove personally costly. "Then we have a week," she concluded, decision crystallizing as she spoke, "to prepare for whatever comes next." Nathan's eyes met hers, a question in their gray depths. "We," Rebecca nodded, shifting Joseph to her shoulder as he began to fuss. "Yes, we. Whatever happens, we face it together." She hesitated, then added with deliberate emphasis, "as the Caldwells." The implied acceptance of his earlier proposal hung in the air between them, significant yet undefined. Nathan's expression revealed surprise briefly before settling into something more complex, relief mingled with uncertainty, determination shadowed by questions he wouldn't voice in Senora Alvarez's presence. The midwife observed this exchange with knowing eyes, but offered no comment beyond practical advice. "You should make it official," she said, "before Hammond returns. Judge Wilson in Cedar Creek would perform the ceremony without questions or delay." "Cedar Creek is 2 days' ride," Nathan noted, practical considerations temporarily overriding emotional complexity. "Worth the journey," Senora Alvarez countered firmly. "Judge Wilson dislikes the Richardsons. They foreclosed on his brother's ranch years ago. He would take particular pleasure in creating obstacles to their legal claims." Rebecca exchanged glances with Nathan, a silent communication passing between them. This development accelerated decisions they might otherwise have considered more carefully, forced clarity where ambiguity might have persisted longer. Yet the practical advantages were undeniable. A legal marriage performed by a sympathetic judge would create significant barriers to Hammond's claim, particularly if backdated to precede Joseph's birth. "We'll leave tomorrow," Nathan decided, glancing at Rebecca for confirmation. When she nodded, he turned back to Senora Alvarez. "Will you spread word in town that we've gone to visit family? Might buy additional time if Hammond's associates come looking while we're away." The midwife agreed with a quick nod. "I will say you have taken your wife and son to visit her ailing mother in Tucson. A journey of at least 2 weeks." Her dark eyes twinkled briefly. "I am known to embellish stories occasionally. People expect it from an old woman." With practical matters settled, Senora Alvarez prepared to depart, accepting Nathan's offer of coffee before her return journey but declining more substantial hospitality. As she sipped from the chipped cup, her gaze settled on Rebecca with unexpected intensity. "The child is a blessing," she said quietly, "as is the man who claims him without being his father. Such gifts should not be refused out of fear or pride." The gentle admonition, delivered without judgment, but with clear insight, struck Rebecca with unexpected force. Before she could formulate a response, Senora Alvarez had risen, returning her cup to Nathan with murmured thanks. "I will visit again when you return," she promised, moving toward the door with the fluid grace that belied her years. To check on mother and child. And perhaps, she added with a meaningful glance between Rebecca and Nathan, to offer my congratulations properly. After she had gone, silence settled over the small house, broken only by Joseph's occasional sounds as he dozed against Rebecca's shoulder. Nathan moved about the kitchen, clearing away coffee cups, his actions deliberate, yet lacking their usual efficient certainty. "We should talk," Rebecca said, finally addressing the unspoken tension that had developed since her implied acceptance of marriage. "About what this means." Nathan paused, then nodded, gesturing toward the table. They sat across from each other, Joseph nestled in the crook of Rebecca's arm, his tiny features peaceful in sleep. "You said, as the Caldwells," Nathan began, direct as always. "Did you mean that, or was it just for Senora Alvarez's benefit?" Rebecca appreciated his straightforwardness, the absence of manipulation or pressure in the simple question. "I meant it," she replied with equal directness, "but we should be clear about what we're agreeing to." Nathan nodded, hands resting on the table between them, neither reaching for her nor withdrawing, simply present, attentive. "What do you need clarity on?" "Everything," Rebecca admitted with a small, self-deprecating smile. "What this marriage would be, what we would expect from each other, how long it would last, whether it would ever be more than a legal arrangement for Joseph's protection." The questions tumbled out, exposing vulnerabilities she had guarded carefully throughout their acquaintance. Yet if they were to enter marriage, even one begun for practical reasons, such honesty seemed not just appropriate but necessary. Nathan considered her words with characteristic thoroughness, giving them the same careful attention he brought to all significant matters. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that steadied something uncertain within Rebecca. "It would be whatever we decided to make it," he said simply. "I'm offering protection for you and Joseph, a home, for as long as you want it, my name and whatever security that provides." He paused, then continued with careful precision. "I'm not expecting anything in return that you don't freely choose to give. Not physical relations, not declarations of feelings that aren't there. Just partnership in whatever form works for both of us." The clear statement, devoid of pressure or hidden expectations, eased some of Rebecca's concerns while raising new questions. "And if I wanted to leave eventually, once the danger from Hammond passed?" "Then you would leave," Nathan replied without hesitation. "With Joseph, with whatever you needed for a fresh start elsewhere. No recriminations, no attempts to keep you where you didn't want to be." Rebecca studied his face, searching for signs of insincerity or manipulation, and finding none. Only the same steady regard, the same honest directness that had characterized their interactions from the beginning. "And if," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to phrase the more delicate question that remained. "If feelings developed," Nathan finished for her, perceptive as always. "Between us over time," Rebecca nodded, grateful for his willingness to address what she had found difficult to articulate. "Then we would deal with that honestly, too," he said simply. "No assumptions, no demands. Just truth between us, whatever that turns out to be." It was, Rebecca reflected, perhaps the most romantic, non-romantic proposal she had ever heard. Offering freedom within commitment, respect, without possession, honesty, without expectation. So different from Thomas's flowery declarations and grand promises which had disguised control and limitation beneath their superficial appeal. "I can agree to those terms," she said finally, the formal phrasing belied by the warmth in her voice. "A partnership based on honesty and mutual respect, with the freedom to evolve or conclude as circumstances and feelings dictate." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Nathan's eyes. Sounds like a business arrangement when you put it that way, he observed. Perhaps it is of a sort, Rebecca acknowledged. But one entered with clear eyes and genuine care, which seems a better foundation than many marriages can claim. Nathan nodded, accepting the assessment without argument. So we leave tomorrow for Cedar Creek. Yes, Rebecca confirmed, glancing down at Joseph, who stirred briefly before settling back into sleep. To become the Caldwells in law as well as appearance. As Nathan rose to begin preparations for their journey, Rebecca remained at the table contemplating the decision they had made. Marriage to Nathan Caldwell. A step that would have seemed unthinkable when she first arrived at his ranch, yet now felt like the most logical progression of their evolving relationship. Not love, not yet, but respect, trust, genuine care, foundations upon which something lasting might be built, given time and nurturing. Or, if circumstances changed, a temporary shelter that could be departed without bitterness or betrayal. Either way, Rebecca reflected, as she gazed at her sleeping son, they would face whatever came next together. No longer alone, no longer carrying the full weight of fear and responsibility on her own shoulders. The realization brought a peace she hadn't experienced since long before Thomas's death, perhaps since Michael's loss had sent her life veering onto its difficult path. Outside, the sun had fully risen, bathing the desert landscape in golden light. A new day, bringing new decisions, new directions. Rebecca rose. Joseph cradled against her chest and moved to help Nathan with preparations for tomorrow's journey. One step at a time, one day at a time, but no longer alone. Cedar Creek nestled in a valley between low, pine-covered hills, its main street wider and better maintained than Merrill Creek's dusty thoroughfare. The building stood taller, constructed of brick and stone, rather than weathered wood, suggesting greater prosperity and permanence. A church spire rose near the town center, its white-painted wood gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Rebecca observed these details with quiet appreciation. As they rode into town, Joseph sleeping peacefully in the sling across her chest. The journey had taken longer than anticipated, slowed by their need to travel carefully with an infant, and to avoid main roads where Hammond's associates might be watching. 2 days had stretched to nearly 3 each night, spent camping in sheltered locations Nathan knew from previous travels. Those nights had reinforced Rebecca's confidence in their decision. Nathan had maintained scrupulous respect for her privacy and comfort, sleeping some distance from where she and Joseph rested, yet remaining close enough to provide protection if needed. His consideration extended to every aspect of their journey, setting a pace that wouldn't jar the baby, finding campsites near water sources to ease their daily needs, sharing stories during the long hours of riding, to distract from discomfort and anxiety. Now, as they approached their destination, and the commitment they had come to formalize, Rebecca felt a curious calm rather than the nervousness she might have expected. This step, however unconventional its beginnings, felt right in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Judge Wilson's office occupied the second floor of a solid brick building that also housed the town's newspaper. Nathan secured their horses at a nearby hitching post, then helped Rebecca dismount, his hands steady at her waist as her feet found the ground. The gesture, practical yet personal, reminded Rebecca of how far they had come from their first cautious interactions. "Ready?" Nathan asked, his expression revealing a hint of the same uncertainty Rebecca felt beneath her outward calm. She nodded, adjusting Joseph's sling to ensure he was secure and comfortable. "Yes, let's meet this judge who dislikes the Richardsons." Judge Ezekiel Wilson proved to be a tall, spare man with sharp features softened somewhat by a luxuriant white beard. His office reflected its occupant's personality, meticulously organized yet comfortable, with well-worn leather chairs and bookshelves filled with both legal texts and works of literature. He greeted them with formal courtesy, that warmed noticeably when Nathan explained their situation. Caldwell, the judge mused, studying Nathan with keen blue eyes. The doctor-turned-rancher from beyond Merrill Creek. I've heard of you, though we've not had the pleasure of meeting until now. On former doctor, Nathan corrected automatically. And yes, that's me. Judge Wilson's gaze shifted to Rebecca and Joseph, his expression softening further at the sight of the infant. And this is your bride and son. Rebecca tensed slightly, anticipating questions about their circumstances that might prove difficult to answer truthfully. But Nathan's response forestalled such inquiries. Rebecca Harper and our son Joseph, he confirmed the careful phrasing, neither confirming nor denying the judge's assumption about Joseph's paternity. We've been living as husband and wife since before Joseph's birth, but recent complications have made formalizing our union more urgent than we'd planned. The judge nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Life on the frontier often outpaces legal formalities, he observed mildly, particularly when children arrive ahead of schedule. His tone held no judgment, only pragmatic acknowledgement of realities common to frontier life. Rebecca relaxed slightly, grateful for the absence of moral censure she had half expected. Senora Alvarez mentioned you might be willing to help us. Nathan continued, moving the conversation toward their practical purpose. Given certain interests attempting to interfere in our family affairs. At the mention of the midwife, Judge Wilson's expression warmed further. Anita Alvarez is one of the finest women in the territory, he stated with evident sincerity. If she has sent you to me, that's recommendation enough. He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping, though no one else was present to overhear. She mentioned Richardson interests. Nathan nodded one hand, moving to rest lightly on Rebecca's shoulder in a gesture that might have appeared merely affectionate to an observer, but which she recognized as silent support. Elias Richardson's attorney has been attempting to assert claims on Rebecca and Joseph based on her previous marriage to Thomas Richardson. Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose. Thomas Richardson, the son who died in that stagecoach robbery last spring. The same, Rebecca confirmed, speaking for the first time since entering the office. My late husband, though our marriage was not what his family portrayed it to be. The judge's shrewd gaze assessed her more carefully. I imagine not, he said after a moment. The Richardsons seldom concern themselves with inconvenient truths when more convenient fictions serve their purposes. The statement, delivered with dry precision, suggested personal experience rather than mere observation. Rebecca recalled Senora Alvarez mentioning that the Richardsons had foreclosed on the judge's brother's ranch years ago. Clearly, that history had left lasting impressions. In any case, Judge Wilson continued, returning to the matter at hand, you wish to formalize your marriage now with documentation that reflects the actual timeline of your relationship. The delicate phrasing, which managed to acknowledge the fiction they were creating without explicitly naming it as such, confirmed Rebecca's impression of the judge as both perceptive and pragmatic. Yes, Nathan replied simply, for Joseph's protection primarily. Judge Wilson nodded, rising from behind his desk with sudden decision. Well, let's proceed then. I assume you'd prefer privacy rather than the public ceremony sometimes conducted in the town square. Definitely, Rebecca confirmed, relief evident in her voice. The last thing they needed was public spectacle that might draw unwanted attention. The judge moved to a smaller adjoining room, gesturing for them to follow. This space appeared designed for private consultations or depositions, with a small table surrounded by several chairs and a window overlooking the town's quiet side street. Wait here, Judge Wilson instructed. I'll fetch my clerk to witness the proceedings and retrieve the necessary documentation. Left alone briefly, Rebecca and Nathan exchanged glances that contained equal parts nervousness and determination. This moment, however practical its purpose, represented a significant step, for both a commitment neither had anticipated making when their paths first crossed. "Still certain?" Nathan asked quietly, giving her one final opportunity to reconsider. Rebecca smiled slightly, appreciating his continued respect for her autonomy even at this late stage. "Yes," she replied simply. "Are you—" His answer came not in words, but in the gentle brush of his fingers against her cheek. The first deliberately affectionate gesture he had offered outside the context of practical assistance. The touch, brief and light, conveyed more than elaborate declarations might have certainty, care, promise. Judge Wilson returned with a younger man carrying several official-looking documents. "My clerk, Mr. Peterson," he introduced briskly. "Now, shall we proceed?" The ceremony itself proved remarkably straightforward. Formal questions establishing their identities and willing consent, brief vows promising mutual support and fidelity, the signing of documents that would record their union in the territorial archives. Throughout, Joseph remained peacefully asleep, unaware of the legal proceedings that would shape his future so profoundly. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Wilson concluded, his formal tone softened by evident satisfaction. "You may seal your vows with a kiss, if you wish." Rebecca and Nathan exchanged startled glances, neither having anticipated this traditional conclusion to the ceremony. For a moment, awkwardness threatened to intrude on what had thus far been a smoothly executed plan. Then Nathan smiled slightly, a genuine expression that reached his usually guarded eyes, and leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to Rebecca's forehead. The gesture, respectful yet affectionate, perfect in its restraint, brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. Not from disappointment at its chasteness, but from appreciation of Nathan's unfailing sensitivity to her boundaries and comfort. "I've taken the liberty," Judge Wilson said as he handed them their marriage certificate, "of recording the date of your union as having occurred 6 months ago when you first established your household together." His eyes twinkled slightly beneath bushy white brows. "Administrative error, perhaps, but one that seems to reflect the truth of your situation more accurately than today's date would." The deliberate backdating, which would place their legal marriage well before Joseph's conception, let alone his birth, represented another layer of protection against Hammond's claims. Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward this principled man who bent procedural rules to serve what he perceived as true justice. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for everything." Judge Wilson waved away her gratitude with a dismissive gesture. "I've had enough experience with the Richardsons and their methods to take particular satisfaction in thwarting their plans, particularly when those plans involve separating a mother from her child." His expression hardened briefly, before softening as he glanced at Joseph. "He's a fine boy. May he grow up never knowing the shadow of their influence." With the ceremony completed and documentation secured, they took their leave of Judge Wilson and his clerk, stepping back into the late afternoon sunlight as husband and wife, at least in the eyes of the law, and whatever observers might take note of their status. "Mrs. Caldwell," Nathan said as he helped her mount the formal address containing a hint of humor that lightened the moment. "Mr. Caldwell," Rebecca replied in the same tone, settling in the saddle with Joseph secure against her chest. "Shall we head home?" "Home." The word emerged naturally without conscious thought, yet carried implications that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Not just a place of temporary refuge, but somewhere she belonged with people who belonged to her in turn. Nathan's expression suggested he noted the significance of her phrasing, though he made no comment beyond a simple nod of agreement. "We should reach the halfway point by nightfall," he said, mounting his own horse. Be home by tomorrow evening, if the weather holds. As they rode out of Cedar Creek marriage certificate, safely stowed in Nathan's saddlebags, Rebecca found herself contemplating the strange turns her life had taken since fleeing the Richardson household. Fear, desperation, temporary refuge that had become something more enduring, a progression no one could have predicted, least of all herself. Now she rode beside her husband, a man she had known barely 3 months yet, trusted more implicitly than she had trusted anyone since childhood. Carried her son born of brief happiness with Michael, yet now legally established as Joseph Caldwell heir to nothing but love and protection, rather than the Richardson fortune and its corrupting influence. The future remained uncertain. Hammond would return, perhaps with reinforcements or new legal strategies. The Richardson family's resources and determination shouldn't be underestimated. Challenges awaited them still. Yet for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca faced that uncertainty without the crushing weight of isolation. Whatever came next, they would face it together, she and Nathan and Joseph, bound by choice and commitment rather than blood or romantic passion. Family redefined on their own terms. Home created through mutual respect and shared purpose rather than convention or obligation. As they rode toward that home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the trail ahead, Rebecca found herself humming softly. A melody her father had taught her long ago about travelers finding their way through darkness toward the light of distant windows. Nathan glanced at her recognition flickering in his eyes as he recognized the tune they had played together on harmonica and accordion during those quiet evenings on the porch. Without comment, he began to whistle the harmony, the sound blending with her humming to create something neither could have produced alone. Joseph stirred against her chest, small face turning toward the combined melody as if drawn by its resonance. 3 souls connected by circumstance and choice, making their way homeward as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Not the ending Rebecca had envisioned when she fled San Francisco, with Thomas's child growing within her. Not the life Nathan had planned when Emma's death left him alone with his grief and guilt. But perhaps Rebecca thought, as their music twined together in the gathering dusk, not every unexpected journey led to loss. Perhaps some detours, however painful their beginnings, could lead to places of healing, to connections that helped mend what had been broken, to beginnings disguised as endings, to dust and redemption.